All right, so hello and welcome everyone. A brief comment from me here in the beginning. Before we start the symposium, the people you see here with me are participants of our Aristotle course. We've just spent almost 3 months reading the Nicomachean Ethics, and we've done something that Aristotle might refer to as the best life, which is the life of nous. So the life of that is dedicated to theoria. Theoria is an activity, or theorein is an activity, as Aristotle describes it, that is basic. We always already engage in theorein, in a seeing or beholding that is at once of the eye and of the mind. And the life that is, as he says, best, the life of nous, is the life that is not dedicated only to, the tradition has turned it into the vita contemplativa, but instead it is that what is necessary. For example, universities should be the place where we go only to contemplate such a text, where we read such a text not to get credit points after 10 weeks or 15 weeks of coursework to get a degree, but to read the text, to ponder what it is to have a polis, what justice is, etc. Now, there are still places that uphold this. Michael Sandel's course, Justice, is such an example. But I've heard that it is no longer possible because the students have changed so much that he can no longer teach the course in the manner he would like to teach it. 9:45 a.m. in the morning, 2 hours. You're not allowed to bring any computers, smartphones, or anything. You are just there to discuss what justice might be. And so what we do here is really trying to live up to this old ideal of doing something for the sake of its own, where the end of the activity is included in the activity. We're not here to read the text to get something out of it that is outside the text. We get something out of it, which is perhaps a deeper understanding of what ethics is, what virtue is, etc. But we're not trying to produce an outcome that has got nothing to do with the activity itself. And that, I think, is perhaps what Aristotle means with the life of, according to nous, the life that actualizes theoria to its highest degree. And this is, of course, as he would say, where we come in touch with the divine. And so now we begin with our first speaker, which will be Andrew Fenton, on, if it's still the same topic, on De Ente et Essentia by Thomas Aquinas, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, correct. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So, the angelic doctor Thomas Aquinas was born in the Lazio area around Rome in 1225 and was greatly influenced by Aristotle, whose major works had been lost for around 600 years after Boetius had translated them into Latin in the 4th century. It was Arabic scholars in the late 12th and early 13th century that had settled in the south of Spain who brought Aristotle's writings with them again from the east. Initially, translations were made directly from the Arabic, which had itself been translated from Greek into Syriac, but eventually the original Greek was found and they were translated directly into Latin for the likes of Aquinas, for instance by the Flemish translator and philosopher William of Moerbaker. De Ente et Essentia, an early work by Aquinas on metaphysics, draws heavily on Aristotle, who is merely referred to in the text as the philosopher. While Islamic commentators on Aristotle, such as Avicenna and Averroes, are also referenced. Both ens and essentia are first principles, Aquinas tells us, i.e., that which is first grasped by the intellect, and it is from ens that we can proceed to understand what essentia is. There are two ways of understanding what ens is, says Aquinas, normally translated as being, basing his argument on Aristotle's metaphysics. Firstly, we should know that ens is one of the categories, but is distributed across all of the 9 others, so that it is the prime category, and secondly, that it leads to true statements. It is by means of the first way, however, that we can acquire a definition of ens or being. This is because the second way includes privations, i.e. negations. Statements testifying to a lack of something are, of course, also true in many cases, but at the same time, there is a certain blindness on the part of the speaker. So complaining about weather, for instance, would be a privation or a blind statement, according to Aquinas, because the primordial being causes the weather. Having derived ends from the 10 categories, we may also define essentia and quiddity. Quod quid erat esse, that which was to be, or hoc per quod aliquid habat esse quid, that via which something has to be a thing. It is also known as a form or natura. A thing is only intelligible due to its essentia, or as Aristotle states, as Aquinas states in his Metaphysics, omnia substantia natura est, all substance is nature. Essentia, however, also points to a thing's actual activity, since nothing can be described without the activity which is peculiar to it, i.e. the efficient cause, whereas quiddity is a thing's definition. Essentia is that through which a being has being. Quod per eam et in ea ens habet esse, that through which and in which a being has to be. Since a being is first named by its substances and only in the relation to it by its accidents, essentia is therefore equivalent to the substances and not to the accidents. Of the substances, however, some are simple and some are composite, but essentia is more present in simple substances. The first substance is the uncaused causa, i.e. God himself. The essentiae of these simple substances are often concealed to us, however. They are pure forms in the Platonic sense, or eidos, so we have to use the composite substances to define them. The composite substances consist of form and material, where the human being is correlated to soul and body. Both of these together are the essentia of a human being. By its essentia, therefore, a thing is recognizable and assigned to a genus or species. The form alone, however, is not the essentia. Essentia is that through which the definition is described, and the definition contains not just the form, but also the material. The material is not something simply added to the substance, but is part of it, Aquinas explains. Only accidents are added to the essence, and accidents do not have full essentia. In their definition, they have to subsume the object that is outside of the category. A red car, you can't just have red on its own. You have to have a red something. Essentia is also not the relationship between material and form, Aquinas tells us, because this too constitutes an accident. The form transforms the material into an ens actu, a being in act, the formal cause. This also affects the accidents. Whiteness causes a white thing in form. And when an accidental form is acquired, this is not a creatio ex nihilo as such, but only in a certain relation. This composite substance, Aquinas tells us, is the same as ousia. Ousia in Aristotle is the same as essentia, he tells us, only the form is the cause. From the effect of warmth that displaces moisture, sweetness is caused. And although the warmth is the cause of sweetness, the sweet body is not named according to warmth, but according to the taste that encompasses both warmth and moisture. Material is also not an individuation principle, but only the material displayed here and now. With regard to human beings, this material is not specified in the definition of a human being, as long as he or she is a human being. We don't say, I saw the flesh and bones of someone. It would only be specified in the definition of Socrates, for instance, if one at all existed. The definition of a human being will not be specified, would be specified not by Socrates as bones and flesh, but by bones and flesh in the absolute sense, which is the non-displayed material of the human being. Avicenna describes Socrates as animalia et rationalia, which is Socrates' quiddity, but of course this could equally apply to other philosophers or thinkers. If the body is the material of the person and the soul its form, ens can not only refer to objects, but can be extended, of course, to a person's habits, which should be directed towards essence, i.e. the soul. A person's habits should be rightly formed. Habits come from habere, to have, and hence this is equivalent to hexis in Aristotle. In a Christian sense, this would mean participation in the sacraments as well as prayer and fasting. Aquinas, for instance, calls communion an act of perfect friendship. Confession and sin is excessive concern with accidents, both of things, of yourself and others, in order to overcome badly formed habits, such as acrasia, incontinence, and achalasia, licentiousness in Aristotle, so that the person can achieve arete, virtue, and sophrosome, temperance, and overcome kakia, vice. Aquinas said that happiness, eudaimonia, comes from two things: noesis, so the vita contemplativa, the pleasure of the intellect, and arete, virtue, and the will should be directed towards both of these, though each is contingent on the other. The more pleasure the intellect gives you, the more virtuous you become, and vice versa. He therefore takes the middle ground between Heraclitus, who said that all is in flux, and Parmenides, who said that what is not is not. Change is good, and non-being is beneficial, providing it is directed towards being. And also extends Aristotle, Aquinas extends Aristotle in this sense, for even the prodigal and wasteful can achieve arete and eudaimonia. Even an adulteress can achieve virtue, as we know from the Bible when Jesus tells the people who want to stone the adulteress, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. We might translate that as, and whoever lives completely according to Uzziah, cast the first stone, which is impossible. And who has no inclination to abstinence should cast the first stone. In this sense, therefore, the sacrament of marriage, too, is a process of focusing on the ousia of the other person, the essentia. The Christian God, therefore, is the God of ousia. What the ousia is in this world, God is the supreme being. The most important of the 10 categories, which also stands beneath the other 9, is ousia. So if we rethink parables in the Bible, such as the feeding of the 5,000, these are the victory of ousia, of the category of quantity. And when Jesus turns water into wine, this is the victory of the category of ousia, of equality. Prayers are said before meals, and fasting is conducted in order to focus more fully on ousia, rather than the abstinence of food. And yet the ousia is much more than just the simple physical essences, which cannot be separated off, otherwise they cease to be ousia. So when Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana, it was not merely the physical substance of water that the wedding guests learned to appreciate. It was the agent that performed the change. So God himself, the primordial cause of change. It has to be grounded in theoria for the essence truly to come to be. It can't just be the physical essence. In this way, for instance, the same takes place in the Mass. The priest representing Jesus changes the physical ousia in the form of the communion host into divine ousia in theoria. You can't just pick up the communion host and go again. You're supposed to be there for the entire Mass, for the theoria to build up. Christ's body and blood is pure essence, but is still physically present in the world, in the communion host. Angels, on the other hand, Aquinas tells us, are pure essence, without any physical properties whatsoever. Angels have infused knowledge. They instinctively know things and have no need for discursive knowledge. So when the wise men came to pay tribute to Jesus in the crib, which we celebrate on the Epiphany, it was not because philosophy had been rendered no longer important, but rather the fulfillment of Greek philosophy, in the same way the prophecies had prophesied Jesus is coming. Knowledge of ousia is also Sophia. The Christian God is the God of Sophia too, as we are told in the book of Jeremiah. God created the world with his wisdom, we're told in that book. Chamak in Hebrew is the word for wisdom, is equivalent of nous, or Sophia, a word which has the Hebrew words have numerical values. The Hebrew word for wisdom, chamak, has the numerical value of 73. 7 being the number of God and 3 representing the Trinity. Knowledge of ousia then is wisdom and is also a first principle, as we can see at the start of both of the Old and the New Testaments. The first word of the Talmud, or the Old Testament, is Bereshit in Hebrew, which is normally translated into English as in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, but it could equally be translated as the first principle. The first principle was a formless void, tahu vabohu, but what already existed was the divine spirit or breath in Hebrew, the ruach, which is the breath or the wind. Existed before the forms existed. God created the forms later. Onic forms, we might say. In the New Testament, we're called en arche en on lodos, ke o lodos en pros ton theon. In the beginning was the Logos. So the first principle in the New Testament is the Logos, which is, I think, in my opinion, could also be the Ruach, the spirit at the beginning of the Old Testament. Literally, it's ton pneuma, which is defined in Greek, which is defined as the spirit intensely roused and completely absorbed with divine things. Theoria, but destitute of clear ideas of them, but it could equally be the Logos, the spirit of discursive knowledge, which sees via a process of dialectics, by worship of Adonai, the Lord, and Yod-He, Vav-He, in Hebrew, the God of Israel, Jehovah, we say, which at the same time is the Hebrew word for being, subsequently turned into the poetic spirit, Chamak, or wisdom, or nous, by King David. Both the Greek world of Aristotle and Homer and the Hebrew society of the Israelites were monocultures, and both succeeded in changing the Logos into nous on their own. But by the time of the New Testament, where things have become much more multicultural, the pagan religion of the Romans is only achieving an imbalance of daimonia, a sort of schizophrenia due to the plethora of pagan gods, which is why there are so many people running around with demons in the New Testament. So Jesus is required to turn us back towards nous by the work of the Holy Spirit, the Heilige Geist that heals you, heiled, makes you whole. Catholic literally means kataholos, according to the whole, a spirit which is close to that which the angels have infused knowledge, in which St. Paul, a Greek-speaking Jew with a sound knowledge of Greek philosophy, testifies to in his writings. St. Paul also tells us not to get overly obsessed with the meanings of words and to avoid arguments about them, and to be of one mind, to be of one nous, the nous that belongs to Sophia. John on the island of Patmos in Revelation 17, before going on to reveal a vision of Armageddon, tells us that both nous and Sophia are needed to understand what he is about to say. Here the angels, the pure essences, or ousia, unfurl the 7 scrolls to herald the start of the apocalypse, in which the physical essences are completely subverted. The stars fall from the sky, the seas and rivers turn to blood and are on fire. The essences of ousia is completely subverted. Jesus' return to earth at the end of Revelation could therefore equally be a symbol or a story of a society's rediscovery of ousia, a reawakening of what the Logos is, following periods of ignorance about the true essence. Maybe we are living in such a time today where ousia has been largely forgotten, a time where we focus excessively on accidentia, physical appearances rather than essences, products that go further and further away from the essence of the original composite substance. Aquinas and hence Aristotle's philosophy.
And
Sorry?
It's now 15 minutes.
All right, okay. Oh, I didn't realize. I was just... Okay, we'll finish there then.
Would you like to add anything? One maybe a line from your conclusion.
Yeah. Just going to say really that let's see if I go forward. I'd think about Duns Scotus as well. Well, I think eventually Aristotle's importance seems to have waned a little with the coming of the Reformation, and it appears to me that, for instance, Heidegger also was very interested in Aristotle, but over the past 50 years or so, or 70 years, the Nicomachean ethics has sort of declined somewhat in relevance. So, but it seems to me also that the whole of philosophical history may be made up of phases of acceptance, critique, and ultimately the rejection of the Nicomachean ethics, and then periods when it's rediscovered. Maybe it's time for the Nicomachean ethics to be rediscovered now.
Good. Okay, thank you. If anyone wants to ask anything or comment on Andrew's talk before we move on to Wendy, please.
I don't have any comments, but I want or questions, but I wanted to say that that was a very thoughtful presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent presentation. Dawson, yeah.
Yes, Andrew, I really like the conclusion where you mentioned that the history of philosophy can kind of be seen as periods of where Aristotle has emerged and has been accepted, because you could see, especially with the early Greek tradition, and then with scholasticism, there would be two phases, right, of Aristotle being accepted. Would there be a third phase, perhaps, or are we to create the third phase? Do you see?
Well, I was going to go on to do something about Duns Scotus as well. I think, for instance, that Duns Scotus was remove the focus somewhat from Aristotle, away from Aristotle, because he said that the system of hexis, so to speak, of trying to move towards the divine, there was something more important than that, and that was the birth of Jesus. He came down as first, obviously, when he was born at Christmas. Well, it wasn't Christmas then. First Christmas, so to speak. That was an act of love, and so therefore love was more important than if you focus so much on hexis, then you ran the risk of it becoming a sort of self-obsessed thing, so to speak. And it was important to look after the oidomania of other people. So that was what Duns Scotus said. And you get William of Ockham, who was very influenced by Duns Scotus, who I think sort of went away from Aristotle even more, and was sort of proto-Protestant, really. Well, in my view.
Yes, the William of Ockham influence led to Hobbes and Bacon. So there is, and then Duns Scotus accepted more Platonic teaching. So there is this, the Platonic Aristotelian debate is really most of philosophy.
Okay, yeah, we've witnessed that quite often now this year too. Thank you, Dawson. Thank you, Andrew. Wendy is next, and then Dawson, you're after Wendy, except if once Michael is ready. But Wendy, you should speak now.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, this is on Aristotle's natural philosophy. Aristotle's natural philosophy develops in the Nicomachean ethics with first principles that are embedded and articulated in the human theoretic and practical spheres. Aristotle's natural philosophy is derived from experience, using both the general and the particular. His practical first principles are expounded by induction from the particular to the general. the particular as potential and the individual as prior to the actual, yet the theoretic general as universal is a priori as a perceptive intelligence. Aristotle's philosophy of human nature and the natural sphere reflects the logic of this syllogism. We experience nature moving in one direction, and yet human action is always the result of a capacity of opposites, and therefore implies a choice between alternatives. If the starting point for syllogistic logic is not a true potential, the actualized first principle will appear but will be false. The first principles of the science of human conduct are incapable of demonstration as those of any other science. These two must in the long run be perceived immediately, and if we cannot see them for ourselves, no one can make us see them. First principles arrive from established propositions as well as accepted opinions. This results in a coherence of principles as expressed by the law of non-contradiction. For if a proposition be true, all the facts harmonize with it, but if it is false, it is quickly seen to be discordant with them. Because the premise begins with a first principle or ends with one, the known is twofold: that which is known or familiar to us, or that which is perceived in itself as intelligible. First principles are acquired as human forms of induction, intuition, or learned habituation, each kind in their natural manner. These principles are key to the subsequent enactment of the true good. Because these starting points are innate, intuitive coherences of thought, the theoretical sciences cannot prove their starting points or first principles. Likewise, the practical sciences cannot deliberate about the end, which forms their starting point. This is due to the syllogistic logic of the middle terms, which appear in the theoretical sciences as causes and in the practical sciences as means. Nous as mind or spirit and phronesis as active wisdom are held together by arete or virtue, as Aristotle states. For virtue preserves the fundamental principle, vice destroys it. This does not mean we are born good or bad by nature. For Aristotle, virtues and vices are not capacities. Rather, it is in the practical understanding of individual particulars in experience that deliver first principles in relation to the human enactment of moral virtues as prudence, inasmuch as the first principles which prudence employs are determined by the moral virtues. In this sense, moral virtues are a living logic and experiential knowledge natural to humans. Aristotle argues, the virtues of our composite nature are purely human, so therefore also is the life that manifests these virtues and the happiness that belongs to it. Virtue preserves first principles, but it is temperance which signifies preserving prudence. Pleasure and pain are prominent human particulars that do not destroy or pervert all beliefs, but only beliefs concerning action. As we inductively arrive at the moment of choosing our actions, Aristotle warns us, the first principles of actions are the end to which our acts are means, but a man corrupted by love of pleasure or fear of pain entirely fails to discern any first principle and cannot see that he ought to choose and do everything as a means to this end and for its sake. For the good of ourselves and others, Aristotle gives us prudence as a compass for navigating our natural human traits within natural philosophy. He argues, it therefore follows that prudence is a truth-attaining rational quality concerned with action in relation to the things that are good for human beings. Prudence is what we ought to do or not to do, whereas understanding merely makes judgments. It is in the moment when we doubt and may deliberate that understanding judges and provides good understanding. The quality of good understanding, or episteme, is derived from understanding as shown in learning. it is in the moment of deliberating, understanding, wisely performs as regards what is advantageous, arriving at the right conclusion on the right grounds at the right time. Arriving in this way while understanding the fundamental principle requires a learning of facts previously known. These are taught either inductively or deductively until there is a conviction arrived at in a certain way, and when the first principles on which that conviction rests are known with certainty. For unless there is more certainty of first principles than of the conclusion drawn from them, the knowledge in question is accidental. Deliberation is what is expedient as a means to the end, and a true conception of which constitutes prudence. The immediacy of the deliberation holds the understanding in the moment and delivers the choice. The wisdom inherent to the understanding is not permanent. This arises from doubt and requires deliberation as an enactment of human nature within the choice of alternatives. For Aristotle, the initiated are not supposed to learn anything, but to be affected in a certain way and put into a certain frame of mind. Aristotle is recognized as the originator of the syllogism, which is the basis for a formal philosophical logic. The syllogism, when practical, states that the major premise is an opinion, while the minor premise deals with particular things, which are the province of perception. The necessary moment arrives when these two premises are combined, and just as in theoretic reasoning, the mind is compelled to affirm the resulting conclusion. This enactment is always a particular act, and no particular can ever be reached by a process of reasoning. The process of deliberation as practical involves only the middle terms, which are intermediate between the definition of the end to be attained and the particular act, which is also an object of simple intuition. The initial general proposition does not include a middle term that would be located between the subject and predicate. The deliberation ends with a particular act, which in turn cannot be connected with the rule under which it falls by a middle term. At each end of the scale, we are dependent on immediate perception. This creates a tension between action and inaction, between excess and deficiency. As with all the other virtues also, there is a certain mark to aim at, on which the man who knows the principle involved fixes his gaze and increases or relaxes the tension accordingly. The success of obtaining the correct tension relies on conforming to the known principles appropriate for the situation. This does not impart wisdom as such, for Aristotle states, yet a person knowing this truth will be no wiser than before. Within the theoretical and practical, there exist two stages of potentiality. These are known as sensation and knowledge. As sensation awakens knowledge, the ground of this difference is that what actual sensation apprehends is individuals, and what knowledge apprehends is universals. And these are, in a sense, within the soul. This accounts for why a man can exercise his knowledge when he wishes, but his sensation does not depend upon himself. By use of perception, the power of sensation is potentially like what the perceived object is actually. While in the process of perceiving the universal by way of the particular appears dissimilar, but at the end, the one acted upon is assimilated to the other and is identical in quality with it. Likewise, the practical mind, which calculates means to an end, is awakened by the sensual appetite, and by doing so, that which is last in the process of thinking is the beginning of the action. This hermeneutic process is a natural process of our freedom to choose. When there is no sensation as such, the faculty of thinking then thinks the form in the images, and what is to be pursued or avoided is marked out for it. The soul is a thinking soul for Aristotle. If thinking is like perceiving, it must be either a process in which the soul is acted upon by what is capable of being thought, or a process different from but analogous to that. With this, Aristotle presents the thinking part of the soul with a capacity as a potential of receiving the image without the presence of an object. And in doing so, the thinking soul must be potentially identical in character with its object without being the object. Mind must be related to what is thinkable as sense is to what is sensible. The wisdom innate in the human soul contains both practical and theoretic wisdom as potential. And although practical wisdom actualizes the good in man and others, man is far from being the highest thing in the world. Speculative and practical thought are both distinct from perception, for perception of the objects of sense is always free from error, while it is possible to think falsely as well as truly, and thought is found only where there is discursive reason as well as sensibility. The logos as articulation of reason and sensibility is what goes forth in the polis or community, where the individual as particular contributes to the formation of the polis as a general universal. It is the practice of speculative thought as articulation that brings forth the good virtue in the individual and others. Once the mind has become each set of its possible objects, its condition is still one of potentiality, but this potentiality differs from that which precedes the acquisition of knowledge by learning or discovery. The potentiality of the individual and the object exists passively, but the individual and the object, or polis, as they are actualized, become one in actuality in spite of the difference between their modes of being. And as mentioned before, this potentiality differs when the mind becomes each of its possibilities. In this sense, the mind is then able to think itself as the polis, and strives to become the actuality of the good that is the articulation of the logos. The freedom of this natural state, Aristotle argues, is the activity of the intellect that constitutes complete human happiness. The hermeneutic continuous process of acquiring our faculties, Aristotle argues, as the reason for which God caused the soul to move in a circle, can only have been that movement was better for it than rest, and movement of this kind better than any other. The mind's ability to think itself excels as it does in contemplation, with the aim at no end beyond itself. For Aristotle, a life of contemplation constitutes complete human happiness and is achieved by virtue of something within him that is divine, and by as much as this something is superior to his composite nature. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. And bang on time, too. Psycheta onta possestin. The psyche is, in some sense, everything that is from the anima. Okay. So, who would like to ask a question or comment?
I would like to say something more, just briefly.
Yeah.
The purpose of this, the natural philosophy is the foundation for natural law, which goes into Aquinas. That's where he is really the one. I mean, there's, I think, St. Augustine and Cicero mention it briefly, but it's really Augustine that takes Aristotle and uses the terminology natural law. So I just wanted to say, because in my original description for my paper, I was going to go in, so I just wanted to mention that that's what I'm looking at is the natural philosophy. That's the foundation for what then Aquinas goes on, which I think relates to what Andrew was saying, which was very fascinating. Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah. If anyone, Andrew, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to mention the natural law as well at some point, but so it's very interesting. It fitted very well. Yeah, sorry.
All right. Yeah, Chin.
The question concerning virtue or hexis, maybe. Did you say that this is living logic?
Yes, I did, because it's based experientially.
It is what? Sorry, could you repeat?
It's experiential. It's natural. It's I don't know. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Just wondering also what you were thinking about when you say it's a kind of logic. I suppose it's from the things you said, it relates to the things you said about the syllogism.
Right. Yeah. And what you get is a lot of intuition, perception, in the logic. So that, so there is a definite experiential aspect to it, and I because, we had to scrunch a lot of things into a little bit, so I just living logic. I mean, that just like, to me, that because it isn't based in our nature and nature, it is in a sense living, I think. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'm looking forward to seeing whether any similarities come out with what I'm thinking on just war theory and your contemplation of natural law there, Wendy. That gave me food for thought there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, James.
Did you come across this section in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7, on akrasia, where he says, for example, here, the lower animals cannot be called unrestrained if only for the reason that they have no power of forming a universal concept. So maybe closer to the Greek would be because they have no conception of that which is katholu. So that which is general. So that our capacity to make generalizations, form general opinions, is actually what can make us unrestrained. That might be something perhaps to consider. That's at 1147b.
Okay. You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why you should be in the. Okay, keep talking, and then maybe I disappear again. I hope from the.
No, I'm done. I will look into that. I don't have my yeah. I'll have to look into that. I'm not quite sure what you were saying.
Well, that it is because you were getting at the how reality is, or how actuality, what is actual, is brought about in the encounter of, let's say, category and experience, or living syllogism and what is being experienced. And hence, though, Aristotle alludes to akrasia is not just being immoderate in terms of desires, but it has to do with a misguided opinion, where we have a knowledge that only is ultimately doxa, But it is thanks to the fact that we can form general concepts that we can at all be unrestrained in the first place, or else we would have to refer to as animals as unrestrained also. But we don't, because we don't just base it on desire or passion, but on our capacity to form universal concepts.
Yeah, what I feel fairly strongly about is that the first principles, if they're not actualized correctly, everything, then you're not going to get the proper
Ja, and das ist wieder, das ist der springende Punkt. That's the salient, that's where the point begins to jump. That's the salient point, because for a Platonist, it's enough to remember the universal form of arete. And for Aristotle, that might just be a sort of doxa. That's fine, an opinion, but it could also be an semblance of genuine knowledge. Hence, it's only ever in the actualization of the experience that the truth, as it were, of that principle, if you actually can live up to it, to put it like that, that is only ever in the situation. So it has to be actualized. Without it, it doesn't suffice. There was a very good paper also. Okay, if there are right now, is there maybe one more question? If there is one, if there isn't, then we move to Michael. Move on to Michael. Okay, Michael Wu.
Could I share my screen, perhaps?
Yes, 1 second. I will have to make you a co-host. So that should now be possible.
Okay, just 1 second. Okay, so I would like to present on the difference between the ethical and intellectual life in Aristotle and how we might be able to bring them together in some activity. And I would just like to make a disclaimer that it's not super organized. I don't have a script, so it'll be maybe a little disordered, but I invite you to comment and speak up as well. So, all right. First, here's a quote from Cicero about Pythagoras, who you may know coined the term philosopher in the Western tradition. And here, Pythagoras replied that the life of man seemed to him to resemble those games which were celebrated with the greatest possible variety of sports and the general concourse of all Greece. For as in those games, there were some persons whose object was glory and the honor of a crown to be attained by the performance of bodily exercises, so others were led thither by the gain of buying and selling, and mere views of profit. But there was likewise one class of persons, and they were by far the best, whose aim was neither applause nor profit, but who came merely as spectators through curiosity, to observe what was done, and to see in what manner things were carried on there. And thus, said he, we come from another life in nature unto this one, the life of theria. And the verb therio also meant to be sent as an envoy, to be a spectator, according to my research. So this is the outline for my paper. It's still a work in progress, but yeah. First, we'll start with the differences between Phronesis and Sophia. and we'll gradually work our way to eudaimonia. So, a key difference, or many key differences between Phronesis and Sophia regard what they're interested in. And this word interest, etymologically, means between being. Yes, so what these two parts of our soul interrelate with in terms of the cosmos, right? And so on the left here, we have phronesis. It's not scientific. It regards things that are immutable, things that are particular. It has praxis, and it has external requirements, which Sophia at least has less of. And also Sophia is more interested in scientific, the unchanging, the first principles, metaphysics. Yes. So let's continue. However, there are also many points where Phronesis and Sophia are related. For example, both have nous, or both relate to nous in specific ways, and they are concerned with the telos. Now, in Phronesis, the telos is concrete instantiation of the abstract, I guess, principle of telos. Like telos as one of the causes or causes, but also, as we'll see later, also as part of the divine, of the relation of the cosmos to God. And both are interested in what is for the sake of itself. So they're not so different. They're not completely cut off from each other, as we've learned in our course. And I hope to bring out kind of how we can expand on this. So yes, I'm very happy to actually go after Wendy, because I think we have a lot of similarities in our papers, perhaps. So from the Anima, Aristotle writes, what can perceive is potentially, such as the object of sense is actually. So Wendy already explicated this a bit. And so perception is done by different parts of the soul. There's a distinction between aisthainomai and sorry, there's a typo here. Should be tereo. Perceiving intellectually or via nous and via the sense organs. Perhaps I haven't read the Anima, so I'm just using some tidbits I found, and I hope it works, but if not, please let me know. And one thing I want to stress is that perhaps theoria is not so different from regular sense perception, because the soul in Aristotle is not like compartmentalized into different parts. It's an integrated system of life functions. There's the nutritive, sensitive, and rational. It's the classical division. However, these are not separate parts of us. And as the human being, the zoon, logon, echon, we direct all the parts of our soul in accordance with logos. So even when we are, even when we eat or we see things or all of this stuff, it's still part of logos for us. We can't just cut ourselves off from our rational part and whatever else. So I want to pose that theoria is also perception in this holistic sense, perhaps, that has the universal, the metaphysical, and also the physical, the immutable and the mutable together, perhaps. And I want to show this by making a distinction between impure and pure theoria. So perhaps this is an anachronism from Kant, but there's a difference between pure and impure, what has to do with experience and what doesn't. So metaphysics, it can be completely a priori, whereas physics, it's a posteriori. And physis in ancient Greek, it didn't mean nature like we think of it. It means what appears, what arises of itself. And Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. So yes, the common interpretation is of book 10 in the Nicomachean Ethics is Aristotle is just discussing like metaphysical theory, like mathematics perhaps as well, and just contemplating these nonsensible, only intellectual things. But theoria is also part of the other philosophical endeavors that Aristotle undertook. For example, biology. So here's this long quote. How am I doing on time? Is it okay if I read this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, of the substances composed by nature, some are ungenerated and incapable of passing away for all eternity, while others participate in coming to be and passing away. But it has happened that where the former are concerned, though they are estimable and divine, estimable here also like it's from time, so honor, honorable and divine, estimable, our branches of theoretical knowledge are less developed, for both about the things on the basis of which one would investigate them, and the things about them we long to know, the things evident to perception are altogether few. Right? We can't see God like we can see animals everywhere. But where the plants and animals that are capable of passing away are concerned, we are better equipped with a view to knowledge because of living together with them. For many things can be grasped about each genus if one wishes to take sufficient pains. Each of the two has its charms, for even if our contact with the eternal things is small, nonetheless, because they are the most estimable ones, knowing them is more pleasant than knowing all the things around us, just as a random small glimpse of the ones we love is a greater pleasure than seeing many other great things in exact detail. But because of knowing the others more and in greater number, they take preeminence in scientific knowledge. Furthermore, because they are nearer to us and more of our own nature, they provide some compensation in comparison to the philosophy concerned with divine things. And this next part is the important part. So we have theoria here, theoretical knowledge of animals. So theoria is not used just for metaphysics, but also for physics. Biology is a part of physics in Aristotle. So for even in the theoretical knowledge of animals disagreeable to perception, the nature that creates them likewise provides enormous pleasures to those capable of knowing the causes by nature. That is why we must not be childishly disgusted at the investigation of the less estimable animals, for in all natural things there is something wondrous present. Okay, and here are pictures of Lesbos, where Aristotle did a lot of his biological research. Okay, so I guess one of the main theses of my paper is that theoria here is also fundamentally concerned with the natural sciences. So now how can we bring Phronesis and Sophia together? Well, I think that as Aristotle's life himself demonstrated, to go out into nature and to do these research programs, they require not just the intellectual virtues, but also the ethical virtues, right? And we see in this regard, the human being is part of physis, about part of the changing cosmos, as well as having a divine element in their soul. And yeah, here, so all of these things here, they require ethics or character, right? I mean, you have friendship with, here's Theophrastus in Raphael's School of Athens with Aristotle, and, they had to work together. Theophrastus worked on the plants. He's the father of botany, and Aristotle on the animals. Also, the endoxic method that Aristotle employs, gathering data, research. This requires life in a polis. This requires, actualizing not just the intellectual virtues, but also the character, the ethical ones. And in the contemplation of nature, right, for example, also we're often met with the sublime and the beautiful, like what can terrify us, what can puzzle us, right? And to scientifically investigate these things, we need virtues like courage. We need virtues, like perhaps some just ordering of ourselves and those around us as well. So that's going to require some more support, but I hope to be able to show this in some sense. Okay, and then we're almost at the end. So next here, there's still kind of a problem because God does not contemplate nature. God, as pure actualization, only contemplates itself. And so the problem here is the best life for humans, eudaimonia, is it to be like God, to imitate God as much as possible, being fully self-sufficient, just contemplating the immutable, principles of the universe? Or does it also involve actualizing our animal nature as well as Zoon? And there still seems to be a problem because if we only imitate God, we're not actually actualizing all of our potential. We still have potential there in our soul that's not, it's still there. It's not being fully developed. And so my kind of point is that only in natural philosophy can we actualize at the same time the ethical dimension of our soul and also the intellectual. So that's what I want to go on to next. And and then I want to tie this into saving the phenomena as a common theme that we've also discussed in class. And that's about it. Okay. And just as a provisional conclusion, what my opinion is at this point is that going out and contemplating nature, not in the modern scientific sense of, techne of, making, but actually just seeing, just going out and just witnessing, the becoming of nature, right? In a virtuous, virtuous way, perhaps. That would be the height of human being. So we stay within our ordered place in the cosmos, not, we're avoiding hubris and trying to be perfectly like God, but we integrate that with the whole that we are part of. So that's it. Thank you. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Another excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Just a comment, Michael. I really liked your, or at least this is what it made me think of, was the contemplation of nature as part of eudaimonia and being in nature. And how important that is.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you refer to saving the phenomena, is that connected to your idea of contemplation in nature?
Sorry, I don't know, but Wendy, you're a little quiet for me. I can't really hear you very well. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I've got a new microphone, so that's not good.
Maybe just move the microphone closer to you.
Yeah.
That's the easiest thing.
Probably. Can you hear me now, Michael?
It's better, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Move very close to it.
I was wondering, in your last slide, you had saved the phenomena. And I was wondering if that was, in your opinion, connected to the contemplation of nature, of going out into the nature to contemplate. Is that where Are those two connected?
Yes, definitely. So Aristotle's conception of God really puzzles me because it seems like God's completely self-sufficient. So uh, God doesn't need us in any sense. God doesn't need the nature or anything. He's just, or she or it is just, there, eternal and perfect activity, contemplating itself. And it seems that the phenomena are superfluous, in a sense. If we just take the life of Theoria of pure Theoria as the highest life, right? But in seeing the principles and the telos of the universe within concrete phenomena, whether it's other people or animals or nature, whatever, I think that is a more better life. I don't know, for humans in a sense, and that saves the phenomena perhaps. But I need to look more into this phrase. I just got it from our class in Hannes, and I think I need to think about it more.
I think you addressed something important though, because you leave your microphone on. I need to turn on my.
Me or Wendy?
You, Michael, because you're speaking. You're the presenter now. Because so one thing I would probably rephrase is perhaps when you say to try and imitate God. When you start writing this, maybe don't think in terms of imitation. Look at Metaphysics Book 12 on God, and look at also what he has to say on God being life, etc. So there is a connection between God and life. And we have to participate in, I think this is what was very strong, is that there is almost, you could almost say, this is a bit imprecise perhaps, but there is an ethical demand placed on us to take part in the world. It's not creation, but we have to save the phenomena in order to contribute to the maintenance and self-governance of the cosmos. The cosmos, I would say, is not simply given. The cosmos is a continuum, and the continuum and in its hierarchy needs to be kept up. If it's not, then the natural order, we could just put it like that, perhaps begins to disintegrate. So
but God would still be
go
there,
on.
right? Sorry.
Well, yeah, but he's also the mover. So he's not just self-sufficient, yes, or unmoved mover, but movement begins from God, and hence also so begins as the telos, but also then folds back to it. I mean, it would all basically, you could say, if there's a disappearance of the cosmos, God is not outside of the continuum. You run into a similar issue of what you're addressing later in early modernity with a thinker like Nicolas Malebranche, who's a Cartesian, but also an Aquinian or Aristotelian, if you like, who has a similar conception of God, where, however, God thinks of himself, and as he thinks of himself, that generates, is simplifying it, and it's not entirely complete, but that generates the world as almost like a byproduct of God thinking of himself, and that and what we perceive is ultimately just, we perceive something on a screen that God projects. So there you could say it's almost as though we don't even need bodies, for example. We could just be in God's mind, which is where ultimately Bishop Berkeley will take the whole thing. But I think in Aristotle, it's quite different. Something else he also made really strong is the notion of psyche, which is not, we should not think of a soul bag that contains different faculties. The psyche is visible. because it's the energeia, it's the activity of body. That's how you see the soul. If you imagine a soul that's invisible, then of course that's an insane statement. But if you understand that psyche is energeia, actualization to the highest of just the vegetative up to our thinking and speaking capacity, then I think what we have in Aristotle is really a religion of the visible, of seeing, of theoria. Theorein is a basic, and if you look at the Greek, theorein is everywhere. It's just not always translated as contemplation. It gets translated as contemplation, for example, in Book 10. But when he gives the example of Pericles as a great leader, Aristotle refers to the activity by Pericles as theorein, as taking into consideration, as beholding what is. So there is always the connection also to, which is in the chapter that you refer to, which is on phronesis. So it's just often, theorein is a basic human activity that we always really engage in, and which is complete in every moment. So it's not a process which has a result in the end. It's complete in every instance. Okay, does anyone want to add anything or ask Michael something? Would you like to add anything, Michael?
Okay, so you said imitate is not very accurate, but participate is better, perhaps. But what would the Greek be? Do you know? Okay.
No, I don't, but go on.
Oh, it's just it seems to fully like to participate, perhaps, if we use this word, in the activity of God, I guess.
Theoria, yes.
Yeah, in theory, yeah. In the way that God does it, it's not really it's kind of not actualizing right all parts of our soul or our whole form. Not form, but our it's not the fullest. I don't see how it could be the fullest activity of human beings because
But it's not the fullest, it's a basic activity.
Oh.
But there are degrees to which it can be actualized. And the highest actualization is the divine actualization. And in the life of nous, which is the best life, is the best life because that brings together the mortal with the divine. That's where that element of the divine is, to the degree that humans can do this, is fully actualized for the human being. So that's where this meets. This is how I understand oidaimonia. That's then where the divine, daimon, is brought into the good fully. So it becomes a good order. That's the on that edge exactly. This is why you need both lives. You need the best life, so-called life according to nous, and the life according to arete. You cannot, just as it's also that I would even go as far as saying there are no different virtues. There's just arete. And yes, he speaks in the Greek of the aretai in the plural, etc. But ultimately, you cannot be prudent and unjust, or you cannot be courageous but imprudent. It's either you're off arete to the highest degree, or you're just to a lesser degree of arete. But you're not ever one or the other. So that it's about degrees and degrees of actualization, I would say. And that also explains the you've moved again. I don't know why it does this automatically, and it's just me in the yeah, that's annoying. So so that I think that would explain the concentric rings of the continuum. So it wouldn't just look at planets, but you could think of the human beings and the polis and natural world, etc., all as concentric spheres that all come together and ultimately are bound up. There's not an outside to, because there's not really a ring. It's a self-contained continuum in which everything participates in the kinetic, perhaps, actualization of maintaining a good order. So that connects to your talk, to Wendy's talk. That's why we have to be prudent and balanced, etc. So there's quite literally a cosmic demand placed on us, and without it, chaos.
So would you say someone who just spends their whole time doing metaphysics, or would that be would that be actualizing the highest degree?
No, because you've got to be. I think it's always both. But what you really would need to have, I mean, and in the ideal world, we do have that, because we have, at least, potentially we have, for example, universities. And a university, that's a time where you spend time to think through, contemplate what certain concepts mean, so that when you form your opinions, you go out into the world, you actually do not become an expert, as it were, who just randomly applies values and models to the world everywhere. Because as Aristotle says, if you blindly apply the universal without considering the particular, then you are literally blind. You are imprudent. And you contribute to the misery of the world, to quote from Albert Camus, because you misname the phenomena. That's Camus. So we have to continuously save the phenomena. They're never saved immediately. They need to be, they're never saved for good. They need to be saved continuously. That is our task. We participate in the weaving and striving of the world. And yeah, so we are ontological beings in that sense. As we interpret the world, hermeneutically go about the world, we basically also have because actuality is always in actu, being is active. It's basically generated. Genesis Kaiftora, it generates and destructs, and we are one part of it, and a crucial one. So the way I think it connects is that you need to have some who are of nous and some who are not, but they are not completely divided from the polis. They're not outside. Today we have this talk of the ivory tower. And look at these academics in the ivory tower. But you need the ivory tower. And it's not an argument to say that no one reads the papers. Yes, that's good. No one should read these papers. It's just, what are they actually considering? That's the issue. So, anyways, you have the final word. I've been speaking too long. Michael.
No, just well, thank you for the feedback, and I will incorporate it in my paper. So
no, it's very good. I look forward to it, to reading it then. Okay, I think if everyone else is all right with that, we might move to Dr. Simpkin, because you've always got to leave.
I'm all right for a little bit longer.
Okay. Well, yeah, you just go. Why don't you just go? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes, mine's still a little bit noty, but hopefully it will be okay. So thanks everyone. I've been enjoying listening to these essays and reports on a stormy night, quite cozy. So my essay is entitled "A Critique of Drone Warfare from the Perspective of Aristotelian Virtue Ethics." For this essay, I would like to draw on Aristotle's perspective on virtue, particularly with regards to balances between extremes, and apply it to just war theory and drone warfare. To what extent does drone warfare represent a virtueless form of warfare, which actually makes war more likely due to a reduction of risk? How is this virtueless form of warfare enabled by the virtual, where screens mediate violence meted out by remote control from thousands of miles away. Ultimately, from an Aristotelian point of view, what is the balance between protecting one's own military personnel from harm without turning warfare into annihilation through the use of low-risk warfare through drones? In order to explore the questions outlined above, first we must connect virtue with the virtual. Both words trace back to the Latin word via, meaning man. Over time, the Romans developed the concept of virtus, which for them came to embody the qualities of moral and physical bravery. Then, during its transition from the Old French vertu into the English virtue by the 14th century, virtue had come to refer to any excellent quality or trait. On a parallel trajectory under medieval Latin, the virtus qualities of the noble and chivalrous soldier had given birth to the word virtualis, whereby the perceived effectiveness of a soldier, their bravery in battle and ability to win, was something projected before them as a kind of avatar of competence. In short, the word virtue is connected to the word virtual through the projection of perceived good qualities, whether those good qualities exist in actuality or not. The claim in this essay is that the erosion of the importance of the virtue of virtual warfare, as embodied in just war theory, has become greatly accelerated by the virtual nature of warfare in particular, and its ability to project perceived good qualities, such as reducing the risk to combatants' lives, while actually accelerating the possibility of warfare, as will be outlined below. Yet, before we can go further, we need to define the idea of just war, before going on to explain how drone warfare undermines it, and then proposing how Aristotle's virtue ethics might engender a rebalance towards just war. Under what circumstances is the killing of another human being permitted? This chilling question sits at the heart of just war theory, the seemingly strange idea that war must have rules in order to somehow separate killing from murder. The founding principle of jus in bello is that of an equal, just war, as it's called in Latin, is that of an equal right for combatants to kill each other without this being a crime. But what can possibly justify such a proposition? Although the foundations of just war can be found in the medieval era, the prominent 19th century Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz commentary that soldiers draw their moral strength from being willing to die. Combatants enter into a death pact with each other. I can kill you if you can kill me. In such a relationship, the violence of war is mitigated, as if it had been done by agreement. At the very least, this moral equivalence amounts to something like the right to a chance of combat. This is not to say that an army has no right to self-defense. Surely one aspect of just war theory is the assertion that combatants do indeed have a right to self-defense. Indeed, on page 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle states that the goal of generalship is victory. No, the problem is not that there is a confrontation between combatants that requires the use of a very real deadly force for its resolution, but that the balance of forces brought to bear against an adversary should not tip over from the proportionate use of deadly force required to defeat said adversary into one of their complete annihilation. Drones undermine this precept by removing all physical danger to the pilot. Without this fundamental pact stemming from just war, war degenerates into what's been called thanatotactics, a putting to death. No longer a duel between combatants, but a stalking between hunter and prey. By subtracting him or herself from the theatre of conflict altogether, the drone pilot ushers in a new era of virtueless war, with numerous perverse outcomes, whereby as drones reduce the social cost of soldiers' deaths in the calculation of war, so too the demand for the use of drones in war, and hence the occurrence of war itself, increases. There is an inherent contradiction between people who believe that you can use war to achieve ethical aims, that's the virtue part of it, and the virtual, cyber conflict, drones, robots. How you can fight wars from a remote distance and have minimal casualties on your own side. But the harm is the belief that if you have technological superiority, you defer civilian diplomatic action and give the military the opportunity to step into this vacuum and offer up solutions. The mediation of violence through the drone operator's screen also incurs a great psychological cost on him or her, since the greater the distance between assailant and target, the easier it is to kill. The one-sided hemiplegic experience of pushing a button and someone being killed thousands of miles away leads to a moral buffering effect, whereupon the reality of what has been carried out takes some time to register. This, what Shamayo calls telecommuting to the war zone, leads to the industrial production of compartmentalized psyches. Eventually, however, the moral bandwidth increases and the reality of the act of killing catches up to the drone pilot, leading to high levels of PTSD. So, what would an Aristotelian critique of virtualless warfare and the rise of drone warfare look like? Aristotle speaks on warfare several times in the Nicomachean Ethics, in particular during part 8 of chapter 3, where he points out that those with superior weapons, in our case drones, often appear braver, but take these away and they will not be so brave. However, Aristotle is not to condemn troops here. He also condemns the false bravery, the general who forces their soldiers into a reckless and needlessly dangerous situation, as not bringing out bravery with them, but merely coercion. A re-engagement with just war theory, from Aristotle's point of view, would involve a reconnection with protective justice, protecting a community of innocence from harmful attack, helps to define what constitutes a just cause for war and constrains the occasions for war. The just principles set out the criteria to be met if war is morally permissible. In practice, this challenging demands requires that political leaders and military leaders learn and exercise the virtues, particularly the cardinal virtues of justice, courage, self-control, and practical wisdom. If war is to be made just, justice needs to be understood in its broadest sense. Such justice, as Aristotle noted, is not a part but the whole of virtue. The end.
Excellent. Very much addresses the unboundedness of modern warfare. The excessiveness, okay. Would like to ask a question or comment.
I would like to
Ravi.
ask a question. Oh, my apologies.
Yeah, sorry, Ravi first.
Thanks, James. Really interesting presentation. I was also drawn to this theme of how does Aristotelian virtue relate to some of the conditions that we find in modernity. Really interesting to think about here. So I was wondering if you thought that, for example, training drone pilots in the to be able to understand the moral and ethical impacts of what they're doing would be able to mitigate the situation, or if drone warfare is just so inherently contradictory to the development of virtue that it's not even useful or advisable for an advanced military, even if we have the capability to wage drone warfare.
Again, this is where I find Aristotle's critique, thanks for that question, Ravi, very interesting, because it can come across as quite one-sided, as, you know, the drone pilots are kind of in this room and they're nice and comfy and they're just sort of shooting people around the world. But one point that I tried to get across there was, you know, how harmful this is for pilots. Again, they're not necessarily at physical risk, but if you look into a lot of the literature, it's the sheer number of people that they kill. And because it's video recorded, it's actually they get a tally. And there was one case I was reading where there was a drone pilot who was increasingly upset by what he was doing, But then the real thing that tipped him over the edge is when he finished a particular tour of duty, he was told that he'd killed over 2,000 people, and he just could not compute that he'd killed that amount of people. It just kind of it caused him, this great moral harm instead of a psychological harm. And the other thing as well is, these are as Aristotle says there, the bad general is the one who puts his soldiers at extreme risk and then gets them to do things and says this looks like bravery. That is not bravery. It's just coercion. So I do think that drones have a place in warfare. I think that the absolute red line, and again, maybe this is my naivety belief in international arms treaties, is that hopefully there will be a new addendum to the Geneva Conventions, which will outlaw fully autonomous drone systems, whereby I feel that at the very minimum there must always be a human being in the loop to make these decisions whether to shoot or not, because what happens if an autonomous drone kills civilians, etc. Was that a fault in the software? Where does responsibility lie? At least with the human in the loop, there's always the person can be held responsible, if you like. But again, as you were saying, Ravi, I feel like if drone pilots or military personnel in general engage with just war theory and maybe bring some of this Aristotelian virtue ethics back into it, we can get into that balance whereby you have a right to defense, you have a right to wage war if needs be, but that it is only done in proportion. And drones take this a little bit too much in the disembodied realm. Again, something that was spoken about in previous Halcyon agendas, about nuclear weapons do the same thing. And Heidegger spoke a lot about this. The destruction of distance brings no nearness. The fact that we can shoot gigantic distances, but that in itself has a dehumanizing aspect. Clausewitz would say, ironically, that if you can see the whites of people's eyes, then that makes war less likely because there's real, there's real lives on the line. And moreover, let's say in modern Western liberal governments, there is, they're going to suffer a political shock. Vietnam War being a classic example. The fact that the American people rose up against that because of the sheer amount of people that were, tragically being killed, it meant that the people had some control over the government. And with drone warfare, that lessens because it can just become cheap for the government to wage war. There's no skin in the game, so to speak.
I'm sure there's a utilitarian out there who will argue in favor of drone warfare. AC Grayling comes to mind. But I guess if you want to build a new college in Bloomsbury, you make a pact with the devil. Okay. Grayling. Michael, I think you had a question. Mike call.
I think Robbie got the most of it. I really enjoyed that. It was it is something that I hadn't thought about so much, and I want to thank you for bringing. Actually, hearing that, the downsides to the use of drones actually very strangely makes me feel more human. I will remember that. It also reminds me of things. Reminds me of War Games, the movie from 1984 with Matthew Broderick, with the Whopper, and taking the human out of the loop, and so on and so forth. Subtle reference, but
yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. James, of course, first, and then Michael and Ravi. I think if we go back to the official order of things, Dawson is next, if I'm not mistaken.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So, floor is yours.
I think this is a great time to tie into what I have to say about Aristotle. And most importantly, Aristotelian ethics requires a human. It requires an active agent, if you like. So it's contra utilitarianism, and speaks to these problems of drone warfare. We'll ultimately always have to have a human, a rational agent, if I can say that, a human to make these decisions, because we cannot know in advance that we have to kill thousands of people, and we'll still have to make the decision, which is where kairos comes in. And I decided to write some introductory remarks and then provide a philosophical poem. So I wasn't satisfied with my prose, so I have some introductory remarks, and then I wrote a philosophical poem. And I do interact with some of Plato's philosophy as well. So the title of this philosophical poem and prose is Kairos, the Moment of Ethics. All of Aristotle's teachings in the Nicomachean ethics hinge upon the fundamental notion of kairos. Without kairos, the opportune moment, as it is translated by Bartlett and Collins, none of the Aristotelian virtues could be actualized. For example, the virtue of magnanimity could not be enacted by a person without the appropriate attentions and at the appropriate time. And to have a theoretical understanding, for instance, of magnanimity would not allow a person the sufficient means to carry out the virtue in actual time. In Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, rather than providing a rule book where one could apply certain principles, i.e. courageous actions in time of need, moderation in one's financial affairs, etc., what is given to the reader, the student, is the insight that all actions require practical wisdom, a practical wisdom that is obtained through experiential knowledge and not from knowledge prior to experience. We need the opportunity and we need the very difficult situations to be able to understand what virtue is. That's when a character is shown. That's when someone's virtue is exhibited. So now for the poem. How can the life of practice coalesce with the life of contemplation? The Aristotelian quest, the right virtue enacted at the right moment. Kairos, the opportunity to show one's virtues. Since he is not bound to the causal nexus, he does not calculate in advance the outcome. It is not a question of the end. The prudent act not through their knowledge of propositions, nor from deliberation alone. The opportune moment presents a right time to enact the virtue of courage, magnanimity, or temperance, which can only be exhibited if one has the wisdom of discernment. For courage without temperance is as great a perversion as wisdom without humility. Philanthropy without restraint is as incontinent as miserliness without liberality. A superabundance of strength, not cultivated, would be given to frivolity. It would waste its own potential, as if it were caught between the dilemma of Plato's charioteer, where the noble and the ignoble horse are always divided, guided by opposing ends, a soul without harmony. Thus, the competing drives defeat one another, leaving the man completely torn asunder. The prudence of a great soul shows itself the moment it is thrown into crises. It carries the weight upon its knee when tested, while the imprudent man is not capable of possessing the resoluteness needed When thrown into the chaos and confusion, he recoils, breaks, and bends under the slightest pressure, while the moment of action demands inestimable character. Like the cunning of Odysseus, he adapts to the situation at hand. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Dawson, I always enjoy your poems. That was really nice, the presentation.
Thank you, Wendy. I decided to change as of last night. I was thinking I needed to try to, in poetic form, explain the virtues. But more importantly, as Johannes has said, it's not these various virtues, it's the character and the opportunities to display or perform, as one translation puts it, to show these virtues. And it's so contrary to contemporary moral theories that demand a proposition. We start off with a proposition, and that we could apply that proposition to all situations. With Aristotle's ethics, that's not the case. It's extremely situation dependent, and as it should be, so that the risks that are involved require someone to modify or to make a sudden decision without knowing the ends, and with knowing perhaps there's great risk involved.
Very well said. I like that.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that poem, Dawson. I just wondered whether you would think of any occasions where you've been able to enact the right virtue at the right moment.
Yes, in a severe case, when someone was accidentally discharged a firearm, and in a moment of intoxication, and I had to personally intervene and get a hold of the paramedics and assist the person. And I had no prior experience. Again, there's nothing that can prepare you for these catastrophes. And I think that ties in with something like your own presentation. Is that even if someone has been behind the board, as it were, killing people, until they're brought into direct contact with what they've done, they don't realize what they have been, I guess, from a utilitarian perspective, have been doing. Because there's not the intimacy or the human element there, so it allows them to not realize how demanding a situation it is, or how severe, it is. And if they see the whites of their eyes, as you said, would they still continue to operate in drone warfare or in these circumstances? It's a difficult question to know the answer to.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, Dawson, very interesting. Thanks. I was wondering, do you think that Kairos, the opportunities for Kairos are greatly reduced in a society that is not really very accepting of Aristotle? James was also talking about the way international warfare is not really regulated according to justness. I think maybe the reason is a lot of the time that it's just utilitarian. It's just based on rights. And I think, for instance, the education system, I also tried working as a teacher, but I didn't really get the impression there's many opportunities for sort of really encouraging people to think. So do you think Kairos is still possible in a world that's so utilitarian?
That's a fantastic question. It is possible. It's just that would be the exception, and we should be an exceptional people. We should be exemplary, and this ties a lot in with what Heidegger has written in various places about Aristotle, and in Being in Time. It seems to be implicit that one needs to be resolute And even though being in time is not about ethics, the action and the comportment, the attunement of Aristotle's ethics is in Heidegger's work. And so you should stand out, and to exist is to stand out. So maybe when people are exceptional in their behaviors, they act without concern for the risk. They sort of break out of the utilitarian trap, and which makes people sometimes makes people less authentic, in the sense that they won't act because they're afraid of the potential harm that could be done to them, or that it might be too unconventional. So I think we should aspire to be more exceptional, honestly, in this utilitarian age. If that helps.
Yeah. Well, it's a good theory. I certainly agree with it. Yeah. It's I think also a lot of the times in business, there's not much opportunity for kairos, because it's so utilitarian. Projects are just done for profit. Yeah. But yeah, I hope there are opportunities.
Yes.
We can even be a bit bolder, even, 2 years ago, I gave a talk at, I think the place is called Cambridge University. It was at a small conference or workshop organized by Ryan Hecker on the hyperdigital age. And I think Dawson was in attendance, or at least he listened to it afterwards. There was issues with Zoom, but I said during that talk that we should consider founding a cosmopolis. And this is something that came out of a year before, out of our course on leisure, on scolaire. Because the reality is also that even though we are all bound, just geographically bound, because we're not angels, Pinker was wrong, as with everything else. But so we are geographically bound, but the fact is one of you is sitting in America, or several of you are sitting across America. One of us is in somewhere in Yorkshire, and all over the world sometimes, and still we meet. I wouldn't say based on values, because I have a distaste for that notion, but based on, well, ideas. That's much stronger as a word. So I have to hand it to Sir Karl Popper. He wasn't entirely wrong. I don't think so. I would almost use his concept of the open society against him. Playfully, I mean, and in good spirits. And be as bold as to say that what is necessary is that new cities are being founded. We've talked a lot about the city in the past 10 weeks, and it is a time for that kind of frontier spirit that you Americans have, and go and find perhaps also, but also found new polities that begin digital first, because that's where we meet. But then they do become, at some point, I think that is what we're going to see in this century. They will become physical. They will start to found themselves, actually, and ground themselves in a physical location, and have a completely new way of handling citizenship, etc. Some projects like that are already out there. So that might, if that were founded on Aristotle, for example, and Plato to a certain degree, because we do need to ban some poets. Not you, Dawson, you're fine, but some we need to ban. Sorry, but then it doesn't feel as though nothing is possible. I don't know if some of you might be aware of Mark Fisher, for example, a British Marxist philosopher who killed himself I think a decade ago, or maybe longer ago. He ends his book, Capitalist Realism, with the infamous saying that I'm going to butcher, which I think is, when nothing seems possible anymore, everything becomes possible. That's roughly what he says. I think maybe because he didn't see a way out, but thought is always already taking us out. And Aristotle sees this also. He has this distinction between something that is in time and what is outside of time. And time is here chronos, not kairos. Chronos is chronological time. And we can be taken out of time. That's the kairos. It's different from chronological time. It cannot be measured. It doesn't matter how long it is. It doesn't matter where you are. And it recurs, that's the a priori, if you like, in Kant. That's transcendental in Kant. So it's already there. It's just named differently. It's the ecstatic in Heidegger. And I know there's all these differences, but we can take ourselves out of and ground ourselves anew somewhere else. The theory is all there. But now what needs to happen is that we bring theoria, theorein, back together with praxis also. It needs to be enacted. And dare I say, we're doing this. So this was a wonderful poem. Dawson this year has 10 days left. So you've got 10 days to put these all together and send them off to publishers.
Okay. Yes.
Good.
It will be done.
It will be done. Excellent. Eric.
Yes. Yes, so this turned more into a longer paper than I originally planned. So I just have to read the first part. We'll see. Okay. What is the human good? How can we, as inhabitants of advanced modernity, acquire the ethical formation that allows us to pursue and actualize it? What do we need to learn, and what sort of experience must we have? What obstacles must be reckoned with, and how can we overcome them? These questions resonate throughout MacIntyre's writings and provide the starting point for a theoretical and practical alternative to the liberal individualism and managerial ideology that has long pervaded Western culture and historically important institutions. Having worked through Aristotle's foundational text, the Nicomachean Ethics, over the last 10 weeks, I want to suggest that we also bring MacIntyre into the conversation on how we may continue our search for a life of prudence, truth, good friendships, and leisure amidst the conflicts of modernity. This presentation, or a paper, consists of 3 parts. Parts 1 and 2 focus on the concept of practice and the narrative unity of human life. These ideas are essential to the so-called constructive argument of MacIntyre's after virtue. I believe that considering both of these concepts can enrich and serve as a natural continuation of the inquiries and discussions we have engaged in throughout the seminar sessions. The third part attempts to bring MacIntyre and Aristotle's classical text into dialogue on the topic of scholae and the relationship between theoretical and practical reason. Here, I especially want to consider how MacIntyre's overall arguments suggest that the practical life may indeed be a life of self-sufficiency, and how his ethics may guide us in enacting such a vision. Before I continue, it is important to draw a distinction between Aristotle himself and Aristotelianism. MacIntyre is a contemporary proponent of the vital and living tradition of Aristotelianism, not of Aristotle per se. Questions about what fidelity to Aristotle entails and the meaning of terms such as neo-Aristotelian, contemporary Aristotelianism are important to consider, but beyond the scope of this brief presentation. Part 1, Practice and the Corrupting Effects of Institutions. Chapter 14, titled The Nature of the Virtues, is crucial for understanding the overall argument of after virtue. Here, MacIntyre shifts from critique to construction, moving beyond his indictment of the notorious trademarks of modernity we're all familiar with,
such as ethical subjectivism, the rise of the behavioral sciences, and the pervasiveness of bureaucratic ideology and social planning, to an intellectual history of the virtues that culminates in MacIntyre's own positive account of practical reason, informed by this classical tradition. Although Anscombe, Nussbaum, and McDowell deserve credit for having brought virtue ethics to the forefront of contemporary academic philosophy, MacIntyre is the one who brings Aristotelianism down into the practical concerns of everyday life. In his writings, Aristotelian thought once again becomes a living tradition that can guide ethical action and help us understand the challenges we as individuals, members of households and small communities, and as professionals in various occupations are facing in our efforts to lead a good life. So, where and how does this project begin? Not from abstract theory typical of modern moral philosophy, but perhaps we could say from a classical sociological perspective, inspired by figures such as Marx and Weber. MacIntyre does not say, here is the Aristotelian catalogue of the virtues. Now that I have retrieved them, let's find ways to apply them, and thus finally actualize the good life. Instead, he begins by asking where, if at all, can we find the social embodiment of an Aristotelian conception of the virtues, or something close to it? In trying to answer this question, he turns to human practices. Practice occupies the first stage in MacIntyre's theory of the virtues, and is defined as, quote, any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in order to achieve those standards of excellence which are definitive of that form of activity. End quote. MacIntyre's understanding of practice can, in principle, include what we, in Aristotelian terms, recognize as praxis, poiesis, techne, and episteme. To give you some examples, painting, writing, sports, games, academic disciplines, or a craft skill such as carpentry can all potentially be considered practices, even though they often aim at an outcome or product. Many people who engage in these activities and become excellent at them take pleasure in them and would continue doing them regardless of the status, prestige, or money associated with the end product. All of these activities can be organized in a way that allows for the actualization and cultivation of virtuous dispositions, and therefore they can be considered praxis and hence ethical. What is crucial is that such practices are distinguished by their internal goods. This is by definition what characterizes praxis. But to claim that also poiesis, techne, and episteme potentially can have internal goods requires some qualification. Take writing as an example. The good of writing cannot be experienced or achieved by any means other than by simply writing. Similarly, consider a skilled carpenter who finds great enjoyment in actualizing his craftsmanship, transforming raw materials into beautiful wooden furniture, or even some precision work few people who are not carpenters would care about or even notice, and continues to work in his garage purely for the sake of enjoyment and further refining the techniques of his craft. In this example, the end lies within the activity itself, and the activity achieved and the activity enjoyed are one and the same state. We can also ask ourselves, what would we do if we were free from all necessity, or if we had the financial means of not having to work a single day in our entire life? To learn a practice well enough to enjoy its intrinsic goods requires honesty, justice, and disciplining of desires. Practices can, therefore, potentially be considered schools of the virtues. This does not mean that simply by participating in a practice we come out as virtuous at the other end, far from it. We can all easily think of someone who has excelled in a particular practice but is not, by any holistic measure, particularly virtuous. Certain notorious musicians, actors, or athletes might come to mind. Some might do it purely for the sake of external goods, like Gene Simmons, who started the band Kiss for two reasons, to get rich and to get laid. Although he probably, during his career, discovered goods about playing in a band or musicianship that he could not experience elsewhere. In one of the first seminars, I remember we discussed the issue of the good thief, a case that poses a similar problem. What schools of the virtues does mean, however, is that practices are the primary sites in which we can learn to appreciate internal goods. We learn to discipline and redirect our desires towards more wholesome ends, pay respect to those wiser and more experienced than us, giving and receiving support from others, and to take pleasure in honesty and honestly, justly, and often courageously becoming good at something. The virtues of character provide the impartial norms of justice to which every member must submit to sustain the ongoing development and enjoyment of the relevant internal goods. To engage in injustice, cheating, and corner cutting means having radically misunderstood what internal goods are. These goods are shared and pursued through cooperative effort, not in competition. In competition for external goods, cheating and corner cutting is rational, provided that we can get away with it unnoticed. Practices, on the other hand, when they fulfill MacIntyre's definition, are common enterprises grounded in the good friendship, where trust and allegiance to the common good, to the common pursuit, provide the ethos that binds people together. Practices must be distinguished from institutions. Yet, institutions are the bearers of practices, and no practice can be sustained without institutional support, at least not for long. For instance, the practice of teaching depends on the institution of schools. Medicine, psychotherapy, and midwifery are practices, whereas hospitals are institutions. But, MacIntyre says, institutions have a corrupting effect on practices, and practices in our age are therefore sites of perpetual tension and conflict. The corrupting effect of institutions is due to their commitment to bureaucratic efficiency and to prioritize external goods, such as money, power, and status, over the internal goods of a practice. The institutions cannot do otherwise. They are dependent on funding for their survival, and they give money, status, and power as rewards to practitioners. These goods are purely instrumental, can be achieved efficiently in many ways, and can be adequately explained independent of any practical means of attaining them. The rational commitment and imposition of external standards of efficiency by bureaucratic institutions can radically mislead practitioners. And an important objective in the management of large institutions is to make sure that they are kept misled and continue to reach for efficiency in technocratic standards of measurement. A practice may be corrupted from within if practitioners themselves prefer the external goods rather than the goods internal to the practice. This, in turn, poses the danger of transforming the very fabric of the practice, from praxis to production, and of legitimizing the transfer of authority in judging what is good, appropriate, and truthful to bureaucratic managers and experts lacking any relevant practical and prudential knowledge of the field, but who instead are considered competent in deciding what's best on the basis of the science of management. Yes, I've reached 10 minutes, so I think I'll end it here.
Feel free to add a bit more. I mean, we've had others who've spoken for 15, so if there's anything you'd really like to add.
I could jump to the section narrative unity.
Okay.
And just read a paragraph. Yeah, so the second stage, MacIntyre's virtue theory, regards the role of the virtues in providing unity and coherence in human life beyond the limitation of a particular practice. The virtues of character we acquire in a practice may indicate an overall direction in our lives, a way to orient ourselves towards good. Thus, practices can be better considered vocations, not merely jobs or professions. As activities that involve ethical commitment and the pursuit of goods, the pursuit of which extends beyond the confinements of a professional role, it can enable practitioners to give a narrative shape to their lives, or at least open up this possibility, which previously could have been concealed from them. Yes, so there's some further... Yeah, so here, the fundamental stance of the virtues implies a certain coherence and consistency in how life unfolds. By acting in good disposition over time, a narrative arc or trajectory will be manifest. To actively developing the virtues through habit formation and the gradual disciplining and transformation of desire is, on MacIntyre's account, to enact a narrative, or we can say we come into character. Narrative presupposes character and vice versa. To say of someone that he is such and such a character implies a certain embeddedness, to place that person in a relation to others where certain patterns are salient and where trustworthy others, as in Aristotle's virtuous friendship, confirm that the person is such and such a character. Yes, so it's more about this. Yeah, just some more. Some claim that understanding one's life as a narrative can only be merited retrospectively, and that to do so forward-looking means poeticizing your life or taking on the role of a Don Quixote. I don't think so. Instead, it is much more practical and down to earth. It has to do with integrity, the consistent pursuit of the human good, consistency in one's reasons for action, a uniformity in one's practical reasoning, which can also encompass moral failure, as long as we're willing to assume that we were mistaken and not a case of not getting what we wanted this time, so let's try again. Hitting the mark and actively work towards becoming a better person who is increasingly capable of hitting the mark, with the help of good friends and educators, will bring forth a certain harmony. A narrative, unless it's a postmodern one or one of Kafka's stories, has a beginning as an end. So yeah, and this goes on for a while. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. Who would like to ask a question? Finn.
Excuse me. It's not really a question, maybe a point of appreciation and something that I perhaps perceived as you were talking, Eric, which is I really enjoyed or I liked the fact that you drew light on this idea of internal demands of practice as opposed to the external demands of validation or metrics or gain. But I also think that what you were pointing to at the end with narrativization has a similar internal holding together. That is to give, as you say, a kind of narrative whole to what you have attempted to do and the results that you have gotten out of it, and how this relates to character in a reliable way is a way of putting that element of that internal consistency of practice into the entire purview of your life, instead of a single mode of doing something like making something. This is about, it's now directed towards the whole of action and not just wood carving or or another practice, which themselves can be vessels towards what was pointed out earlier in these talks as the unity of arete. That is not, it's not just courage, it's not just generosity, but it's all of those things that have to come together. And a single trade or practice may be a way onto that. But perhaps what you were saying about narrative is this more unified view of all of those things.
Yes, exactly. Very common. You could think maybe perhaps of practices as the training ground where you discover the good. And then part of the internal good of a practice could be, okay, what is a good life which is oriented around this type of activity? And you go from there. And but of course you can also live, there are many ways to approach it. And also both practice and narrative are the two first stages. There's another moral tradition which even brings it all together in a sense. But yeah, and in regards to virtuous disposition, I was thinking about chaos, which is interesting. Yes, it's always in the moment, but still, if you act courageously of the chaos over time, there has to be some persistency. I mean, at work, sort of as the baseline where all of these instances occur.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Before we move on?
Oh, I have a small question. Do you see the goods of internal practices leading somehow to other practices and perhaps higher practices in a sense? Like if I'm concerned with like bricklaying, let's say, but the internal goods of bricklaying kind of expand somehow, and I have to consider, eventually all the way up to maybe architecture itself, and then to mathematics and metaphysics. Like, do you see something like that as possible?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's also a topic of discussion within the MacIntyre scholarship, how complex or sort of objectively speaking, what are the characteristics of a practice that that fulfill the definition? And it's funny that you mentioned bricklaying. Have you read After Virtue?
Yes, a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah. Because he mentions, he says, no, bricklaying and tic-tac-toe are not practices. So, but
Oh, okay.
but I don't know. I discussed this with someone moving, and he claimed that moving, what do you call these companies that move? Just pick up furniture and move. Now that couldn't be a practice, but someone else disagrees. And no, it could, because you could take pleasure in it, and there could be good colleagues, there could be good teamwork involved. So, but yeah, I guess you would have to be, yes, it can also be doubted. I mean, one argument against that would be, there has to be some of the capacities, enactment of the particular human capacities, virtuous capacities. And I worked as a dishwasher several summers, and I don't think I could ever make that into a practice, or that it could ever be a virtuous activity, because it's just not, yeah, uh, it's just possible not for me to really enact my expend my energy in a really wholesome way by washing dishes. Yeah.
What if you worked in like a 3-star Michelin restaurant?
Yeah, maybe.
That was a joke, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Good. So I think next one up is Mike McCall. Yeah. Thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah. So I'll be giving a presentation, and I don't think it'll take more than 10 minutes. It's going to be quite light. I think you'll feel that it's not academic at all, but hopefully it might make you laugh and hopefully ask a few questions.
Huh.
Let me put this on screen. Oh, I need to share.
Yeah, you should now be able to do so.
Okay. Okay. Let me know if you can see that.
Not yet, but that might be.
Sorry. There we go.
Yeah, coming up.
Okay. All right. So I spent a lot of time with dreams and psychology. And so my personal interest, I wanted to overlay the ideas of Nicomachean ethics actually with my dreams, see where it was present, and then also correlate that with sentiment. So was it a happy dream? Was it the presence of phronesis, as an example? Was that a positive thing for me? And overall, I have explored 230 dreams in the last 3 years. I've transcribed and I've interpreted them, so I write them all down by text. I used a numerical method called beta analysis that actually extracts the sentiment of the dream, either positive or negative. So the positive piece, if it's a wonderful dream, I'm happy, that's going to get a high score. If I'm having a nightmare about Terminators trying to kill me, that's a negative score. Then what I did is I overlaid the concept of a Nicomachean ethic, and I put together a list of 24 Nicomachean concepts like phronesis, and I correlated that against the sentiment of the dream. What does it prove? I don't know. I just thought it might be interesting to look at. So I'll go through that, and then I'll give you a quick summary of 3 different dreams: 1 positive, 1 neutral, and 1 negative. And again, I just hope you find it interesting and maybe fun to think about. So I have transcribed 230 dreams over the last 3 years. I put together a simple Python script, and I used ChatGPT to build this. That just straight up, I'm not that smart to put together Python code, but I can execute it once it's given to me. And so I used something called VADR, which is the Valence Aware Dictionary and Sentiment Reasoner. And I analyzed all those dreams, and they either got a low score, which is a nightmare, or a high score, which is a good score. Hopefully you want high dreams. So what happened? Well, I mean, if you work in any type of industry or you've taken statistics in course, we have a lovely bell curve, right? And it turns out that the mean score was about 0.032. The neutral score would be exactly 0. So my dreams were just a hair positive overall. And they ranged from positive 0.22 on the right-hand side to negative 0.16 on the left-hand side. So this stuff in the middle, this is, just par for the course dreams. The stuff on the right is, I don't know, maybe I won the Super Bowl, or, maybe I dreamed of the holy city of Jerusalem coming to earth or something. On the left, this is blood and guts. So, all right. And so then what I did is I used a large language model, again, ChatGPT, but you could use something else. And what I did is I looked at the dream sentiment, and what I did is I said, if you see a Nicomachean concept, I want you to extract that. Now, is it validated? No. But what it is doing is it's taking a look at the definition of a Nicomachean ethic, and it's looking at the dream content, and it's computing a similarity score. So a truly mathematical connotation. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. So I looked at 24 altogether, and the top 6 are shown in green. So these were correlated with a positive dream. So this is, probably a good thing. And I found deliberation, golden mean, practical wisdom, moral development, common good, and then reciprocity of all things. And those all had scores that were like way above average. I also had some that were below average, and a little confusing, actually. So the bottom 3, just for example, were courage, harmony, and responsibility. And one thing I can tell you is that the dream characters in my life are actually mostly people from my family of origin. And so there was a lot of conflict growing up in my home, and so there was a lack of harmony. And so in some cases, I think it came up as kind of a negative thing, if you will. So I looked at the top 3. So deliberation, obviously, is, and I can't pronounce it, but I'll say Belusis. It's a rational process of thoughtful consideration about how to achieve a goal or an end. That was ranked quite high. And actually, I'm a very deliberative person. I would say overly so. I would say that I perseverate about things constantly. And also what I did is I built a word cloud based upon the emotions that I extracted from the dream. And so those things were obviously in big: nostalgia, hope, reflection, curiosity, but in some cases also anxiety and confusion. So with the deliberation came some anxiety and confusion, at least within the context of the dream itself. The next one, and I was really pleased to see this, was the golden mean. Golden mean in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is a key principle that defines virtue as a balanced state between 2 extremes, excess and deficiency. And personally, that's actually something that I strive for in my life. I try not to go hog wild or crazy about one thing. I try not to go off the deep end on the other thing. I'm always trying to find something in between the 2. And that came out very positive in my dreams. It was commonly represented. And when I had that type of experience in a dream, it turned out to be a positive dream. So the mean score was 0.032. When golden mean was identified, the score is 0.045. So it was better than average. And so what are some of the feelings? Nostalgia, hope, reflection, curiosity. Honestly, some of the same types of emotions I extracted from the other dreams. Anxiety, discomfort were on the downside. This one, responsibility, this came out kind of low. The average score was 0.032. This was on the low end, 0.013, probably still in the middle, but kind of darker than some of the other dreams. In Nicomachean ethics, responsibility is closely defined to the concepts of voluntary action, choice, and moral accountability, and is a product of deliberation. This one presented some issues for me. And as you can see, frustration, anxiety, guilt, curiosity, shame, introspection. And in some of these cases, it amounted to either in the dream itself, me making poor choices, ultimately, being irresponsible, or potentially one of the characters in my dreams being irresponsible. So a quick discussion of 3 dreams that I had that I thought would be kind of entertaining to look at. This was an example of a positive dream. And I need to apologize in advance if this causes trauma for anybody that's concerned about US politics. So I dreamed actually of a well-known American politician who is now the president-elect, who was running for office. And this particular individual is not somebody that he's not my cup of tea. But in my dream, it was a good thing. And I was impressed by the politician's use of a vertical web landing page, his messaging, and his strategy. The 5 dominant emotions were admiration, conflict, longing, relief, and safety of all things. So completely unlike me, but in my dream that turned out to be quite real. The concept that I pulled out of the dream, or that the large language model pulled out of the dream, was logos, a rational principle. It was evident in the politician's campaign strategy and the strong organizational skill. On a sentimental level, I found the politician pleasant and accessible, which boosted the sentiment score of the dream, to my surprise. A neutral dream, but also one I think is kind of positive and easy to look at. I dreamed of visiting my mother in California, and my mother in this dream facilitated discussions with at-risk immigrants, trying to create a sense of community. And also, I noticed that there was a malcontent trying to bully my mother, of all things, and I confronted that individual, and I stopped that from happening in the dream. The dominant emotions were tension, gratitude, anxiety, yearning, and relief. And later, I went for a bicycle ride with my mother, which I never did in my real life, actually. And obviously, we're riding through California. We're both quite fit, so that's a good thing. So the large language model identified eudaimonia flourishing as a prevailing Nicomachean concept. I think that's fairly straightforward to look at, and I thought that was kind of nice to consider and to work up. I also had a nightmare, and I've tried to make it kind of funny. So I dreamed of a physical fitness regimen. I hired a trainer to help me improve my hip strength, and one regimen involved climbing a wall at a very high rate, which was 3 meters high. And in my dream, I broke my leg. And a subsequent visit to the ER made the situation much worse, as the poorly trained physician was just a complete moron. So up top, you can see, obviously I'm climbing the wall. Then down here on the bottom, I've got a broken leg. I've got WTF because the doctor is incompetent. So dominant emotions were frustration, determination, vulnerability, and skepticism, and shame. The dominant thing that came out was phronesis. And actually, not because I think there was practical wisdom here. I think it was actually the complete lack of practical wisdom on my part and the trainer's part and the doctor's part. So that, a total cluster, if you will. And so I think it's kind of funny to look at after the fact, but at the time it wasn't. I put it down at the bottom, actually. I called it an appalling lack of phronesis is how I put that together. So reflections from me. Let's see if I can get this to, there we go. Logos was very important. Golden mean was very important. And then I think there's one more supposed to be there. Maybe I took it off. Polis, the sense of community. And actually that is something that actually I get a lot out of in this class, actually. So even though we're not together, I still feel like we're a virtual community, not virtue, but we're still a virtual community, and something that I get a lot of satisfaction from. And it's a lot more fun to study topics like these when at least you've got somebody to bounce some ideas against, as opposed to just reading a book, which is also wonderful. But for me, the polis, that's actually something that pulls for me. It's actually very important. So anyway, that's it.
Thank you very much. Very unique. I'm surprised you can remember all these dreams when you wake up.
I write them down as soon as I get up.
As soon as you get up.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you try to write down all your dreams or the main one?
Probably 80% of them.
How does it work?
How does what work?
What are the writing? Do you use your laptop or what do you do?
I get to I usually have a cup of coffee first, to be honest, and then while I'm waking up, the dream is still fluid, and so I will write a few notes into my phone, and then I come upstairs and I just try to transcribe it, and then once it's transcribed, I can always get to it later. And so I use ChatGPT, which I don't think is entirely valid, but it's fun. It's kind of interesting, and then you can tap different APIs to actually look at things, whether it's Vader sentiment or something else. Mm-hmm. And psychologically speaking, I don't think this is necessarily philosophy, obviously. But psychologically speaking, I think it's healthy. It's healthy to think about what you just dreamed and reflect on it. And it may provide you with some insight, or maybe just a bunch of junk. But it's worth it.
How do you to use that kind of language? How do you separate noise from signal?
For me, actually, I would say it's mostly about the intensity of the dream, whether it's positive or whether it's negative. The stuff in the middle, if I have a random dream that feels like it's of no consequence, I might not write that down. But most of them are worth writing down, at least in my experience.
Great, thanks. Anyone else has a question or a comment? Andrew, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting, Michael. Fascinating. I was wondering, I don't think I caught anything like that in your talk, but were there any factors which you found? Have you found any factors which determine whether you have a dream that was positive or neutral or a nightmare? Maybe any habits you practiced in the evening or the day before? Maybe not drinking coffee too late, or I don't know. We hear these things. Have you ever found anything like that?
I would say practice-wise, no. I do take certain medications, but I don't think those have had any particular impact. I would say the predominant factors usually are stress at work, stress at home, or something else, actually. The factors that increase the positive sentiment are usually associated with individuals, and likewise with negative sentiment. Most of it, I think, is relationship oriented. And some of them are just nightmares, and some of them are goofy fun dreams.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Michael.
Thanks. That was really interesting and also very entertaining as well. So thank you very much. I was wondering, have you thought about like doing it might be too invasive, but like asking other people about their dreams and seeing if, especially with these relationships, like if you can find some common ground or meeting point there, and maybe
Michael wants to go into business with you, he's asking. Just so polite.
So I would say that in today's day and age, with cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotropic medications, I would say that the idea of dream interpretation has fallen out of favor. But obviously, if you've read any historical text before 1950, you would realize that it was something that was very important, or that most people perceived as important. I don't know the answer to your question, Michael. But one thing that I have done is I've tried to become more of a human these last 10 or 15 years. You can use the technology. And so if I'm thinking if I have a dream that has difficult, I can pull a painting using artificial intelligence. And so I can link a painting or a poem or another philosophical concept like the recurring, what is it? The notion of eternal recurrence by Nietzsche. I can pick these philosophical concepts and I can link them to the dream. Now, what does it all do? I don't know. But what it does do for me is it helps me think about it. And also detract from just like what happened in the dream versus what can I pull out of this? Maybe there's something interesting that I could apply here ultimately. So I don't know. I think it'd be fun to try, but I'm not a psychologist. So.
Well, but that's great though. It's you're using frameworks just as a, not for fun, but like just to see more and not just to fit things into it.
And I learned more about Nicomachean ethics along the way, obviously, because I had to think it through.
Thank you. What did you mean to try to become more human? Were you a reptile before? No.
Candidly, I'm an engineer in statistician. And no, not at all. And I'm a business person. I was, since you asked,
it's so candid. It's funny. So
I was
it's
deeply
excellent.
involved. I mean, I was Republican Party all the way here in the United States, and I thought life was just an exercise of force and will. And I think that works for a lot of people until you get to be about 40. And then you start to realize that there are many, many, many things you can't control. And maybe the arts were worth studying all along. So.
Excellent. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that. That was really good and very candid. I shared with everyone here this short essay that we have from Aristotle on dreams.
Cool.
It's just a few chapters really, so that might be interesting. He doesn't have that much to say, but Heraclitus has a few things to say on dreams, and not that much, but maybe on sleeping. And maybe also just because you mentioned you were an engineer and then you became human, you may have heard of the novel Homo Faber by Max Frisch, who was a Swiss author. Might be it's an easy read. You can read it in a couple of days. It's not too long. I'm gonna share it here. Share a link to the Wikipedia page of the book. He is an engineer, and yeah, he tries to become human, but it goes well, it goes the way it goes. It's worth reading, really. So very important book. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Unique presentation, I have to say, and I have to admire the tenacity with which you apparently get up every morning and sit down and have the discipline to write down your dreams in this manner. I don't think I would have that discipline for 230 days on top of it in a row. Terrifying to me. But that's so you have perfected the arete of discipline. Okay. I think I'm going to have to look at the list here now. So yeah, it's Chin and then Ravi.
Hello. Thank you everyone for your talks. So I had the intention of presenting a talk on the idea of the apparent good as it appears in Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics and related to various things, but it was a bit too ambitious and I had to come to the reality that I never really graduated beyond Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So I've written a essay on hexis as it relates also to proairesis. but also I think I became caught by a kind of Kantian condition. I also never graduated from that. So there may be certain Kantian aspects. So this is the essay. Central to Aristotle's ethics is a notion of hexis, variously translated into English as disposition or active condition. In the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle comes to consider what it is that arete of character, that which relates to the aspects of the human being that resembles aspects of other animals, what the nature of this kind of arete is. For Aristotle, arete of character is something which is concerned with our feelings and actions, and consequently, it relates to pains and pleasures. For, quoting Aristotle, pleasure or pain follows upon every feeling and every action. Feelings and passions are present in all humans. It is through these that we come to have our pleasures and pains. But those passions, the latent capacity for existence having been present within us from birth, none of us can be praised or blamed for, and neither our ability to experience these passions. How we stand in relation to these passions, however, namely to what extent the presence of these passions induce pain or pleasure, is something that one's character can stand in good or bad relation to. Such a stance is not merely given. It is not by nature, because anything which is by nature presents itself as having to undergo a necessary activity. As Aristotle gives an explicit example, it would be impossible for the rock to not fall downwards, this being its nature. However, these stances present in character, that which compose character, are changeable as we come to know from experience. Though this is not to say that changes in character come easily or quickly. Hexis is the word given by Aristotle to such a stance or state in character that allows us to receive our passions in conscious manner, and the restful state from which new activity, or energeia in Greek, arises that results in future feelings. It is, however, also developed through activity. In English, the significance of hexis and habit seem to blur, but it is important to distinguish these two words in order to prevent any misunderstanding. Habit, taken as habitual activity, is a way of getting to hexis. Even less can we call an arete of character, in which we may include such traits as courage, temperance, generosity, etc. Even less can we call these things merely habit, for arete of character is a species, a kind of hexis, which becomes developed by good habitual activity, and which allows good habit to be reliably begotten in future activity also. However, arete and hexis are not activities in themselves. Aristotle, with his concentration of attention on the notion of hexis, opens up a manner of speaking that responds to the demands of a question posed by practical reason. By responding with a theoretical invocation, so Aristotle responds with a theoretical invocation concerning the nature of the human being. The question posed by practical reason is, how can we come to understand, come to know and practice for ourselves good and harmonious character that allows us to live in harmony with ourselves, with others, and with the cosmos at large? That which we call practical reason must consider the sphere of action, and harmonious action is judged by Aristotle to be actions that stand within the mean, with courageous action neither too confident, nor too foolhardy, nor too cowardly, with charitable action neither too prodigal, nor too parsimonious. With each of these extremes destroying the integrity of the action. But to speak about the appropriateness of action can only carry the exposition to the limits of action, and not beyond it, stopping short of arriving at the source of action itself, which is the human being. The nature of action, however, is not being neglected by the consideration of the source of action within Aristotle's exposition. The jump to the source, in fact, gives space for certain questions concerning the goodness or appropriateness of actions to be considered. For actions can be committed in ignorance or from ignorance, and they can result in feelings of regret when the particular outcome is not the end one had in mind. It would be wrong to blame or praise a person for an action they committed from the ignorance of the full circumstances, or for an action for which they were not the moving principle or the source. We may only blame or praise a person for their voluntary actions, those actions committed from within themselves with sufficient understanding of the particular situation. The seemingly recapitulatory exposition contained in the beginning of Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, when Aristotle considers what voluntary action is, shows us that the practical considerations of what good action is cannot be separated from the sources of it. But the sources of action being seemingly many, including within it desires and drives, spiritedness and temper, this question of what is good and bad at the source of action reflects the same question that was faced in Book 2 concerning the specific nature of arete and hexis, that is, in the threefold distinction of the parts of the soul as relating to feelings or passions, being firstly the passions themselves, anger, joy, envy, etc., secondly our capacity or ability to experience them, and thirdly the active stance or condition with which the human being holds themselves against or towards that experience. Similarly, a similar distinction may be put forward with regard to action. Firstly, the latent sources of action, the moving principles inside of us. Secondly, the innate ability of the human animal to bring these capacities into activity. And thirdly, the unique human stance in which the human being orients themselves in relation to their ability to bring these actions into accomplishment. As in the case of hexis, it is a specifically active stance by which the human being holds themselves towards what is present and given that is worthy of consideration, and worthy of the appellation of good or evil, worthy of blame or praise. In the case of action, the active stance towards it is a deliberative thought towards particular action that brings the thinker or deliberator to the point of understanding of how a particular act relates to their character. It is only with deliberation that one can be said to be making or having choice, that which Aristotle calls proairesis. Despite the mutually active stance of both hexis and proairesis, the latter stands closer to human intellect than hexis does. Proairesis is as a result of the concerted deliberation on the changeable circumstances undergirding an action. It is the result of an activity of the human intellect, and human intellect must be presumed for its existence. Its importance is in the fact that it does away with ignorance at the source of action. So this relates to the voluntary nature of certain acts, that they have their source within the agent and that they are committed without ignorance. And so the importance of proairesis is that it allows us to presume that there was no ignorance at the point of action. However, the notion of proairesis says nothing about whether the action is at all possible to be committed reliably and sufficiently by the deliberator themselves. The question, therefore, must turn again to that which makes action possible, that which allows us to bring about the kind of activity through deliberation we may give the descriptions of courageous or temperate or generous. It is a notion of hexis that centralizes this concern and gives what we may call a provisional answer. If the deliberative practical thinking of the goodness of acts involved in ethical philosophy draw out the manner in which a person should conduct themselves for the development of good character, as Aristotle does in the later books of Book 4 and Book 5, it is a theoretical moment of the invocation of hexis in Book 2, a stable state underlying the unity of character itself, a theoretical supposition that grounds that practical philosophy. As theoretical supposition, hexis is the assumption of a stable and autonomous state apart from human intellect, which is developed by action and allows action to come about. Yet despite the distinction from intellect, it stands in analogy to intellect or knowledge, the knowledge one may have of making something or of some demonstration, for both are seen only through their activities. With knowledge, through making or through demonstrating something, just as the presence of a kind of hexis is discernible only through the habitual activity or feelings that are present in an individual. Analogously standing with each other, both are totally invisible when not in action, hidden within oneself as if in reserve, waiting and biding its time to come forth. The notion of hexis is based upon an understanding of human nature that is not merely anatomical nor schematic, but predicated upon the tacit yet essential understanding of a human being as a time-bound, time-determined being, whose character is inscribed with qualities in time over a duration. The working of time, however, also muddies the waters. It is difficult to say anything for certain over beings whose lives are under influence from something other than the power of their own wills. So it is important for Aristotle that his auditors, his students, are charitable towards his discourse and give power over to certain exigencies of time to favor an embodied sense of time-bound development of human character, that which we call education, than to expect an exactitude of speech and exposition over matters of ethical philosophy. Another difficulty surrounding the nature of hexis is that despite being, for Aristotle, the central mark around which the moral activity of the human being seems to turn, it is not directly perceivable. And this mark, though the signs lead us there, is not visible to sight, amenable to touch, nor present to the ears. It is what Kant would millennia after Aristotle call a noumenon, a source of action that is as invisible in the world as the activity of thinking itself. Thinking in this manner shows, in fact, that though Aristotle distinguishes between hexis and knowledge, for merely knowing what to do does not mean that one is able to do it. The narrative of character, a species of hexis, is ultimately an intellectual characteristic or quality that has been inscribed into the human being. For the development of a life genuinely directed towards arete, what is required is a genuine recollection of the many practical concerns of human existence into an articulated whole. This theoretical moment being what we may call politics. Therefore, it seems reasonable to say that the development of good hexis, good states of character, requires the theoretical seeing of the ends of human actions and human lives, and that ultimately, arete is a production of thinking, though it may not be the thinking of one individual, but of generations and of a polity or a people. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Any questions?
So I wanted to ask about, oh, Michael, please go.
No, you go ahead, Michael. I think he's just clapping.
Oh, okay.
Digitally clapping. Go ahead.
So I don't have a good basis for asking this question, but I just yeah, I wondered if you read any about like Aristotle's conception of time in the physics. Because I think it has something to do with motion as primary, right? And time is like a secondary quality almost of motion or change. So I'm asking this because it seems, yeah, Dawson said kinesis in the chat. So would it make sense to say that we're bound by time or anything like this if time is a feature of kinesis instead of like having its own independent reality or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't read anything about time as it relates to Aristotle. I think I've probably overstepped my own bounds once again and said something that I have no knowledge over. But I think in that section when I was talking about the human being as a time-bound, time-determined being, it's really I was trying to point towards the fact that unlike, I guess part of it was thinking about what we've been talking about in class, and Johannes has been emphasizing about what ethics or ethical discourse has become as a kind of thing, as certain things to be applied. But hexis is this thing which is developed and which cannot just be applied. It's something which is developed, and so it has to. The results bear themselves out in time also, because it's the fact that it's a state from which other future actions are brought about reliably. It's So it's much more of a there's a kind of letting be and saying it will come through with the application of action by habitual activity, but also it's something that will beget future activity. And so the eye of the practical philosopher stretches over long periods of time rather than an instantaneous application of something. And it's also in the first book, Aristotle has this thing about ethical concerns stretching over generations. And I think when you think about the nature of hexis, this becomes much more evident. It's not a superstition about ancestors. It's the fact that maybe even one generation is not enough to develop hexis, because it assumes education is this thing which I suppose how I was thinking about it is that a polis has these norms which allow certain behaviors to be developed, which expedites the process of development, which if you were to invent the wheel and start from the beginning, you may not be able to do. So I don't know anything about time, but that's what I was pointing towards.
You could, if you wanted to add anything on this, you could just look at the book 10, something we didn't really discuss in the seminar, but which will be part, so it wasn't in the lecture either, but it will be part of the book, is what is in time and what is not in time, chronos. But we did discuss, if you remember, kairos quite often. So, but the time that's mentioned in physics is not the time of the ethical sphere. There's another issue. It's also how everything is so confused today. Is that that's in strict spheres, and the sphere of techne is not the sphere, is not the ethical sphere. Period. And the same is true when we consider physics, which is visible, etc. Now we can consider movement and time in it, but that doesn't stretch into the ethical sphere. It's connected. You need to show how the continuum then belongs together. But the time that is human time, chronological time, is again distinct. And the art is always, as it were, to show the conceptual unity of a philosophy such as that of Aristotle, without, however, conflating the different spheres. But go on, Chin, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I don't have anything more to add to that question, I think.
Okay, Michael. The other Michael now, Mike.
I thought your presentation was very well written. Even though you spoke it, it was really well written and it was easy to understand and assimilate. What it reminded me of, and I don't know if you have if this overlays anything, or if you have a comment on it, is the concept of act of commission versus act of omission, and how that overlays maybe with being ignorant of the right thing to do, if you will. So if somebody is ignorant of an issue, are they still responsible? Ultimately, if they fail to act because they're ignorant, is there any accountability associated with that? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it kind of maybe it's not an academic perspective, kind of notion of you should know better. And it was your responsibility to educate yourself, or it's your responsibility to educate your children to know the difference. Johannes, I don't know if you have any comment or any ideas on that.
No, Chin should respond.
I think maybe I could have addressed more of that in the essay, and thank you for your compliment. I could have addressed that more if I was to write a longer piece, because in ignorance, when Aristotle talks about ignorance in book 3, chapter 1, it's more about ignorance it's really ignorance about the particular situation. So you didn't know that this was going to harm someone because, the object is not what you thought it was. But as the discourse progresses in that book, it seems like Aristotle then starts to consider, and this was what I was initially going to write about how people's perceptions make them preclude other ways of seeing things, because what their character is, because it's not aligned to perhaps what Wendy was saying about the first principles. It's not directed towards the first principles. They perceive, or rather imagine, things which are not the case. And so perhaps maybe it's not the same thing as what you were referring to, but perhaps through that way of being, they omit certain duties, perhaps because they don't have sight of the first principles about what a human is meant to do, say. And Aristotle says, in the moment, it seems like you can't put blame on them because everyone does what they wish for. And if their wish is awry or wrong or not directed towards the first principles, they can't do much about that, because deliberation arises when that wish is fixed. So all of these things by which the human being consciously hold themselves against experience presumes already a certain base state of character that is developed to a certain point. And I guess that's why education is so important for Aristotle. And it's completely, you cannot neglect it at all when talking about ethics and ethical development. You can't ignore education, and therefore you can't ignore the polis, because the polis, I think, is what ensures the right ordering, and the good nature of the polis is what ensures good education also. So, but Aristotle does say that if your character has fallen to such an extent that you miss out the first principles completely, then there has been a falling off. It's in book 3. It's like in chapter 5, 4, 5, something like this. And yes, I didn't get to writing about that, but I think maybe in this idea of omission, Aristotle addresses it to an extent.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, last but not least, Ravi, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks everybody for some great talks so far. So my presentation is called Deliberation and Practical Wisdom in the Wake of Modernity. The challenge of interpreting wisdom passed down from ancient past lies in the difference between prior conditions and current conditions. In the case of Aristotle's great treatise on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, we may say that a great deal of his observations and analyses remain relevant to us. The consideration of intentionality for making judgments about virtue and moral responsibility, for example, remains influential on our own thinking about jurisprudence and judgment of our fellow members of humanity. Yet some of it seems to come from a different time. The concept of practical wisdom, or phronesis in the Greek, in particular, raises the question as to where it fits in our present world. In Aristotle's conception, the virtuous person must possess practical wisdom, or phronesis, through which they deliberate on the nature of the concrete good in a particular situation, leading to actions that meet the mark of virtue, inclining neither to one nor to the other extreme, resulting in the good life. The idea of practical wisdom through deliberation seems to make sense to us. Indeed, it seems the way that a virtuous person should act in an ideal world. They should be able to deliberate and choose reasonable actions, informed by experience, that are adapted to the situations and reveal an underlying quality of courage or kindness or strictness, as the case may be. Yet where in our lives do we see the opportunity to exercise such wisdom? Instead, we find endless laws, formal and informal, some that no one person has instituted, yet rule the entire length and breadth of our lives as human organisms from birth until death. In childhood, students are sent to schools to be managed in groups where strict standards of behavior are enforced. The domain of home life is not truly a respite for the child, but is often a zone where parents are busy with their own employment in institutions ruled by similar strict rules. There is perhaps a notion of the ethical life that is allowed to take root here, but it is still regulated such that if emotions or behavior in the family system depart too far from prescribed norms, they are to be treated by the apparatuses of psychiatry or other governmental institutions. The child progresses to higher studies and then stares out into the economy. There is a range of choices presented to them, but all follow the same rule, the rule of money, and so they are compelled to enter one or another of the established modes of making money in society. These institutions, like the schools, are run according to strict standards of behavior and productivity, and they are regulated by government bureaucracies that leave little flexibility for their organization, unless, like in the US, they are able to make an end run around them, where technology is so new that bureaucratic regulation can't catch up to them. It is true that we are able to exercise freedoms such as the freedom to pick our profession and life partner that would not have been possible in earlier stages of society, but there is a cost, which is that our lives are oriented towards unceasing production. Escapes from this are possible, but are greeted with social sanction and are always at a knife's edge away from slipping into true delinquency, at which point one is made an object of concern for the social services department or even the criminal justice system. Simply put, it seems as though our lives do not have the scope for the sort of deliberation that is required to acquire the practical wisdom or phronesis that Aristotle writes about. Instead of the opportunity to take a free ethical action and learn from those successes and failures what is the way that leads to virtue, we are confronted from a young age on every side by a predetermined answer that is already worked out for us, whether by the schoolmaster or the supervisor in the bureaucracy we are playing a part in, or by the psychological experts that have determined what are appropriate ways of thinking and feeling for us. The difference between our time and Aristotle's time is the advent of modernity. Modernity can be thought of as a complex of ideological and social structures that differs from traditional societies. Traditional societies were based on trade of simple goods, customary religion, and unquestioned hierarchical social structures and customs. Modernity brought about a change from this to industrial modes of economic production, urbanization, bureaucratization of government and economic institutions, specialization of technical knowledge, and new formalized ways of interaction between people that led to reorganization into blocks and eventually atomization. In short, modernity brought about a continuously increasing systematization of life. This was an irony, for the characteristic philosophical insight of modernity is not that of systematization, but that of the freedom of the reason and will of man from predetermined structures. However, that freedom was employed to construct new systems of power using new technologies, producing new, sometimes monstrous structures in place of the old ones. The free and simple wisdom of the local village was no longer sufficient to keep a tally of millions of men who needed government services, or build a hydraulic sewer, or build a factory to mass produce canned goods. We put in place rational guidelines piece by piece across government, economic, and social institutions that let us manage this new complexity. But in doing this, the rule of reason created a system of systems with no escape. The problem for the ethical life is that the system convinces us that we cannot be blamed for the ill effects of our actions so long as we are following the system. In Aristotle's analysis, intentionality is essential for virtuous action. It is not simply enough to make the correct action, it must be done with the right intention. And one's blame for mishaps, on the other hand, is mitigated if one doesn't have the full knowledge of one's action. Thus, the systematization of life compromised the scope of the true ethical life. If the rational system is authoritatively certified to have the correct knowledge of life, and we follow the system, then according to the system, we are not to blame for the results of our actions, and we are thus not morally responsible. If the system goes on to absorb a greater and greater percentage of human action, then there is eventually left no one responsible for anything at all. And the most terrible things may be committed under the pretense that we are simply following the science to an inevitable conclusion. The end of this systematization of life is a complete automation of thought itself, as we see with the advent of artificial intelligence. AI is here and it is too late to stop it. As with any technological advancement, it is futile and needlessly alarmist to protest it before we see the potential benefits and have a chance to mitigate its drawbacks. But these drawbacks are already apparent. AI is dangerous because it threatens to replace the need for human thought entirely. Thought, like physical activity, is strenuous, and there is a temptation to avoid it if at all possible. However, like physical activity, thought is essential to what makes us human. The use of AI may start because the need for a cognitive boost to write a demanding email. Then somebody may look to fill out a work or school project with the assistance of AI. But if AI begins to be used to replace, for example, thinking through an ethical dilemma or for life guidance, it destroys the process through which the deliberative rational capacity can be formed and assures us that someone will never have any phronesis, but will instead be an automaton carrying out the actions of the average self-help article. To make our way back from this situation will not be easy. There is ever more pressure from bureaucracies to claim jurisdiction over aspects of the human experience, and those who claim to be fighting bureaucracy may have even more insidious technological designs in store. The most promising route to me seems to be to go back from the systematizing tendency of modernity to the central insight of human freedom. But it's not enough to simply use freedom to fulfill desires through technology. We must use this space carved out by freedom to practice deliberation about the ends we want to achieve and see as good. And then we may once again see that practical wisdom can play a role in the life of humanity. This practical wisdom is necessary for two reasons. First, it is a good in itself. It is needed for the full flower of our humanity, as a technologically systematized life is an impoverished one compared to one in which we have full scope to make judgments about what actions lead to the highest concrete good. But second, at this moment when so much is at stake in the global situation, a return to leaders and citizens who are able to make practical wisdom a part of their life might be what's needed to turn the tide of human affairs. And that's the end. Thank you.
Perfect. Really good. We have to be very, very worried. But those who want to get rid of bureaucracy have the same suspicion as you. Who wants to ask a question? I think last time we did the same thing. You were the last speaker during the Plato Symposium, and you brought everything back together and also summarized basically the entire course. You have a talent for that. And also bringing the ancient and the modern together. Michael. And then I think Dawson, who was also eager to speak.
So what would I don't know if you have any children or if you have a younger brother or nephew, cousin or somebody like that that you might end up advising. And just for the sake of argument, let's say that you've got a young man or woman, maybe 20 years old, and they're at university. And so I have a 17-year-old son. How would you advise them, knowing what you know now and from the other training that you have in philosophy? What would you advise them about? I mean, the advent, there's lots of technologies, but the advent of AI, I think, is unique. It will change everything. And so what would you say to them? How would you advise them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder because it seems like the use of AI in universities is becoming so prevalent, and I think there's never really a possibility of like taking somebody completely out of their social situation or the social norms that they're present with. There's I don't think it would be advisable to like make them an island unto themselves that has no contact with the outside world, and say like you have to read Latin texts and you can't use um, ChatGPT or contact. So I don't think you should say, don't use use AI for any sort of assistance, but just try to um, impress upon them the value of being able to think from oneself. And I think like moral exhortation can only go so far. There needs to be some sort of practical benefit to the student until they're able to be able to accept the good of thinking in itself or the goodness in itself. Um, so you can make them aware that, like, you know, if you can think for yourself, you will. I think it's too crude to say like those who will be able to think them for themselves will have greater success in life. Um, but like, yeah, if you're able to master the art of thinking outside the technological system, then you will be able to manipulate it more in your career, for example. So that's like a utilitarian argument about why you should be able to think for yourself outside of the AI system. Um, but then if there's it's also able to like calculate to impress upon them the virtues of the value of, you know, you can't assume that everybody wants to be a philosopher, for example, but introducing them to something of the value of like touching grass or um yeah um or these kind of more offline modes of thought. um Yeah, so I try to, and yeah, they can use the AI tools to for a purpose. But so I would, yeah, probably go with the combination of like utilitarian arguments towards for why it's good to be able to develop some sort of separation, as well as trying to um as well as where possible or applicable, giving the more philosophical arguments as well.
You said something very important, if I may interject briefly. You said outside. Now, what have we been discussing the entire time, basically? How is it that theory and praxis go together? There are always, and I would say that there's always an outside, but we tend to, there's something that occurs with the technological age where there seems to be no outside to it. And if we now just go to Heidegger briefly, Heidegger, as you know, speaks not of the essence of technology, a terrible translation for das Wesen der Technik. He speaks of das Wesen der Technik. Das Wesen, he means in the sense of Staatswesen, the realm of the state. So Heidegger addresses the realm of technics. It's got nothing to do with machines, and it wants to be exclusive. It's the realm of techne that wants to be exclusive. But there are other spheres that we are in. One of those spheres is the ethical sphere. And in it, calculation plays a part, but not the only part. There is a hierarchy of thinking. We could go to Aristotle, for example, to consider this. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that there is an outside to it. So even using these tools that we're using right now doesn't mean that we are completely captured by technology. That's a faulty assumption. It's an absolutization of technological tools. It's actually a conflation of the technological tool with the metaphysics of it. So it takes beings as being. That's the conflation. Instead, what we should be able to witness is that basically the computer, as we're sitting here, begins to disappear. It appears again, if you think back to how we discussed the different modes of presence, as ready at hand and present at hand when it breaks down. But what is in the foreground is thinking, is here now, is thinking and contemplating and trying to understand, listening to someone else, thinking along, which is what commentare means, and trying to tease out, draw out, make sense, etc. So there's a technical tool and the infrastructure that we're using, but the sphere in which we are is an ethical sphere. And that we shouldn't forget. And here's a very important passage in Plato's Phaedrus that we also, I think, discussed earlier this year, and which I also addressed briefly in the Cambridge lecture on Plato as a myth maker, which is the myth of Thuth. It's a terrible word to pronounce. But if you remember, this god is the inventor of writing. And Plato here warns against writing. A most ingenious Thuth, the parent or inventor of an art, is not always the best judge of the utility or inutility of his own invention, replies Thamos the pharaoh, because the god Thuth assumes that he has devised with writing something, a tool by which to increase memory. And now Thamos warns him that you've done something else. Here, and in this instance, you who are the father of letters or of writing from a paternal love of your own children have been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminding, or is just a reminder. And you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. So they will become doxosophoi, seemingly wise. They will be hearers, and remember, there's also these sections in Aristotle also where it could just be that someone is acting, etc. So again, the issue of doxa has been with us forever. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. This is 2,500 years ago. So there's nothing new under the sun. King Solomon was right in that regard. So we are confronted with something that's been with us, and we're confronted with it now even more. It's coming to the forefront. So ChatGPT, LLMs, etc., could help as reminders, just as we use. If you use Wikipedia as a reminder, like where exactly is it that Aristotle says this in the internet in general? I use the Perseus library extensively, the Greek original text, etc. I have them here, but it's easier, and then I can look up the precise form if I don't know it, etc. But that serves as a reminder. It doesn't serve as a replacement for thinking. But the task going forward will be to cultivate and develop really based on what we already know, and as Chin pointed out, argued so well, that arete is built over generations, how to instill in the young still the wonder of thought, that they are amazed by the world, just as it is, as it presents itself. That's the beginning of thinking. Without that, ChatGPT can't do you any harm if you have no sense of wonder in you anyway. So what's it going to destroy? There's nothing there. So the art will be, or the task will be, to develop now new ways of teaching where you don't just bring all these new tools in because they're available. But basically, by the way, in Europe, all over Europe, governments over the past 10 years decided in infinite wisdom to bring in iPads to the classroom. And now all but one of them, which is Germany, of course, are removing iPads again, or smart tablets, or whatever they're called, because they lead nowhere. They actually, students don't concentrate. They don't learn how to write. Sweden was, of course, as always, at the forefront of that development, and I think they're now the first to move off it, of the use of tablets. So, because it is never just about the tools of the machines, that there's you have to be, if you're not moderate or balanced, then we've all been there. The desire kicks in, and you cannot stop using doom scrolling or whatever people do. But we are confronted with the issue of that Aristotle and Plato in different ways, but they both address, which is the relationship between semblance and being, because you could just say something and tell something to yourself and have that perfect, as Aristotle would put it, the orthos logos, the correct logos, the correct propositional statement, always ready. But once confronted with a situation, you may not actually be, you have to realize, I have no idea what I'm what's actually going on. Aristotle has a wonderful example. He says, someone who knows in general that light meats are healthy, but doesn't know what a light meat is a fool, basically. If you don't, because you have to not just know what counts as light meat, you also have to know how to prepare it, or else that correct statement gives you nothing. It's correct, it's true, but it's worthless. Okay, Ravi, back to you, and then Dawson.
Great points. I was addressing the question more as like, what would you advise a 20-year-old who's already in college and all their friends are using ChatGPT? But you're right that if you're the one in charge of designing the educational system, it's definitely worthwhile trying to think about ways we can educate students without using these tools, finding ways to engage them without using the tools. And continue to develop those capacities. So, I think that's a valuable perspective as well.
Dawson.
You're muted.
Thank you. Absolutely inspiring. And you were also our closer for the power course. So, you've almost become the go-to, the best at summarizing everything at once and also providing your novel insights. Yes, I think just to add to what you have been saying is you can't emphasize disconnecting enough. You can't emphasize being outdoors enough. And in order for, as you said, to make it stark contrast between the technological sphere and the lived world, the Lebenswelt, the life world, lived world, and these spheres. If you don't get the contrast enough, you will not be able to be reliant on, for instance, cognition when you need it. You'll have to rely upon an external device or a resource to stimulate your thought, and also without the physical exertion and the outdoor experience, then one becomes docile and in so many problems today. So I think just you can't emphasize the grassroots enough in this day and age for the youth especially.
And remember the cave. Always remember the cave. Illusion is what shackles them. So it's not that new, all of this. It's maybe more intense.
Mm-hmm.
But also something else that came out of James's talk, and he's no longer here, but something to ponder also is what the connection is between the word in Latin, vis, virtue, and virtual. I mean, they're not necessarily maybe perfectly related, but there is a bit of a connection here. So, okay. Well, any closing remarks by anyone before we disappear into the night of winter solstice, the day of Halcyon, by the way, given that this is when the Halcyon bird breeds?
I would just like to thank everyone and thank you, Johannes, for your engagement in getting us to think and everyone's insights. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ravi, I didn't want to take away from you, by the way, if you wanted to respond to Dawson.
Oh no, thanks for your comments, Dawson. I didn't have anything to add right now.
Happy Halcyon Day, yes. So thank you very much again. I look forward to reading your essays then. Next year, I'll be in touch. And we'll set a deadline for maybe, I don't know, a month or so or 2 months. So maybe mid-February. I'll find out, whatever makes sense. And then we publish these essays, and I look forward to reading them. I may have to rewrite again a few things now that I've heard you talk. So it's that's the worst part about writing is you start, you finish, and then once you've finished, you have to actually start writing again. And rewrite again and again and again. Or maybe that's the good part of it. I don't know. It never seems to end. Which again should also tell us something, is that they're not endless but infinite, these works. And maybe if I may, because I pulled it out now, Metaphysics 12, chapter 7. If then the happiness which God always enjoys is as great as that which we enjoy sometimes, it is marvelous. Moreover, life belongs to God, for the actuality of thought is life, and God is that actuality, and the essential actuality of God is life most good and eternal. We hold then that God is a living being, eternal, most good, and therefore life and a continuous eternal existence belong to God, for that is what God is. So, this is Aristotle on God. Of course, there's more. Again, thank you very much indeed. I see you in the new year, where we shall read Goethe's Faust. That much I can tell you now. If you care to join, of course. That's a different story. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good work, everyone. Take care.